chair may declare a recess at any time. Before we get started, I want to recognize a moment of silence for the victims of the white supremacist hate crime in Buffalo, New York. The subcommittee has focused intently on that threat in both open and closed hearings. It is utterly devastating to see more victims of this violence. Buffalo, our heart breaks for you. With that, I ask my colleagues to join, we will now turn to the business of this hearing. More than 50 years ago, the U.S. government ended Project Blue Book, an effort to catalog and understand sightings of objects in the air that could not otherwise be explained. For more than 20 years, that project had treated unidentified anomalies in our airspace as a national security threat to be monitored and investigated. In 2017, we learned for the first time that the Department of Defense had quietly restarted a similar organization tracking what we now call unidentified aerial phenomena, or UAPs. Last year, Congress rewrote the charter for that organization, now called the Airborne Object Identification and Management Synchronization Group, or AIM-SOG. For short, today we will bring that organization out of the shadows. This hearing and oversight work has a simple idea at its core. Unidentified aerial phenomena are a potential national security threat, and they need to be treated that way. For too long, the stigma associated with UAPs has gotten in the way of good intelligence analysis. Pilots avoided reporting or were laughed at when they did. DoD officials relegated the issue to the back room or swept it under the rug entirely, fearful of a skeptical national security community. Today, we know better. UAPs are unexplained, it's true, but they are real. They need to be investigated, and many threats they pose need to be mitigated. Undersecretary Moultrie, Mr. Bray, thank you for coming today. First, we need you to update us on the status of AIM-SOG. The legislation creating it was passed in December. The deadline for implementation is fast approaching, but the group does not even have a named director. We need to know, sirs, the status of the organization and the obstacle to getting it up and running. Secondly, you have to convince the audience today, and most especially our military and civilian aviators, the culture has changed. That those who report UAPs will be treated as witnesses, not as kooks. Thirdly, you need to show us, Congress, and the American public whose imaginations you have captured. You are willing to follow the facts where they lead. You know, we fear sometimes that the DoD is focused more on emphasizing what it can explain, not investigating what it can't. I'm looking for you to assure us today that all conclusions are on the table. One final note, we are mindful today that AIM-SOG is not starting from scratch. This is the third version of this task force in DoD, and civil society groups like the Mutual UFO Network, Mr. Corbell and others have been collecting data on this issue for years. I hope you'll explain how you can leverage the knowledge and experience of our prior work on this matter to move the AIM-SOG along. The last time Congress had a hearing on UAPs was half a century ago. I hope that it does not take 50 more years for Congress to hold another, because transparency is desperately needed. I now turn to Ranking Member Crawford for comments he'd like to make.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Honorable Moultrie and Mr. Bray, thank you for coming here today. We appreciate it. To begin the open dialogue between Congress and the executive branch on this important topic. While this topic evokes creative imaginations of many, aside from all the hype and speculation, there are important underlying issues posed by UAPs. Despite the serious nature of this topic, I have to say I'm more interested in our understanding of Chinese and Russian hypersonic weapon development, or understanding why this administration was so slow to share actionable intelligence with the Ukrainians. However, inasmuch as this topic may help us better understand unknown activities of Russia and China, I am on board. The intelligence community has a serious duty to our taxpayers to prevent potential adversaries such as China and Russia from surprising us with unforeseen new technologies. As overseers of the intelligence community, this committee has an obligation to understand what you are doing to determine whether any UAPs are new technologies or not. And if they are, where are they coming from? In general, the IC spends much of its time and resources trying to understand what we call known unknowns. When it comes to foreign nations' weapons systems and sensors, known unknowns are those features that we don't fully understand yet. The challenge associated with UAP is that they are completely unknown and require a more expansive collection and analysis effort. The intelligence community must balance addressing known threats to our national security with preventing technical surprise. We must continue to follow the facts where they lead us and ensure that there are no technical surprises. The IC must take it seriously when there are credible observations of phenomena that seem to perform in ways that could pose a threat to safe flight operations, or that could be signs of a foreign adversary's attempt to develop a strategic technological surprise against the United States. It's also essential that our pilots and others feel they can report UAPs they observe without any stigma for doing so. This is the open, unclassified portion of our hearing. We'll have a closed, classified part later. It's important for the public to know that the classification of information exists to protect national security, not to try to hide the truth. When we're trying to determine if any UAPs are new technologies being developed by foreign governments, we are inevitably going to run into classified information about what new systems and technologies we do know are in the works here or abroad. But where information does not risk national security, it should be shared with our allies and the public when feasible. I hope that we can have your assurance to this end today. It's my hope that the intelligence community will continue to try to determine the nature of UAPs we've observed and will keep Congress fully apprised of all developments. I look forward to this hearing and continued dialogue and oversight with the intelligence community on this topic. And with that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back, and now I will turn to our distinguished chairman, Adam Schiff, for any comments he wishes to make.
Thank you, Chairman Carson, for holding this open hearing on unidentified aerial phenomenon and for your leadership on this issue. Holding a portion of our discussion today in open session is critical to the cause of transparency and openness, which was Congress's intent in authorizing and funding this new task force. The larger effort that is being undertaken to study and characterize UAP reports is an important step towards understanding these phenomenon, what we know and don't know. And I look forward to hearing more during both the open session and the closed setting about how DoD and the IC are undertaking that task. UAP reports have been around for decades, and yet we haven't had an orderly way for them to be reported without stigma and to be investigated. That needs to change. UAP reports need to be understood as a national security matter, and that message needs to go out across DoD, the IC, and the whole of the U.S. government. When we spot something we don't understand or can't identify in our airspace, it's the job of those we entrust with our national security to investigate and to report back. That is why it's important that we hold this open hearing for the public to hear directly from the Department of Defense on the steps it's taking to track, analyze, and transparently communicate the work that is being done on this issue. It is also the responsibility of our government and this panel to share as much as we can with the American people, since excessive secrecy only breeds distrust and speculation. I look forward to hearing how the UAP task force is being stood up, what challenges they still face, and how this committee can make sure the task force is able to shed light on one of the world's most enduring mysteries. I thank you gentlemen for your work, and be very interested to hear what you have to say. To me, among the most fascinating questions are these phenomena that we can measure. That is, instruments report there is something there. It is not the human eye confusing objects in the sky. There is something there, measurable by multiple instruments, and yet it seems to move in directions that are inconsistent with what we know of physics or science more broadly. And that to me poses questions of tremendous interest and as well as potential national security significance. So we look forward to hearing what you're able to report to us today in open session, and I want to thank Chairman Carson again for his extraordinary leadership on this issue, and I yield back.
Chairman yields back. Thank you. With that, we will start our hearing. Under Secretary Moultrie, the floor is yours, sir.
Thank you. Chairman Schiff, Committee Chairman Carson, Ranking Member Crawford, distinguished members of the subcommittee, it's a privilege to be here with you today to address your questions regarding unidentified aerial phenomenon, or UAP. I'm pleased to be joined by Mr. Scott Bray, the Deputy Director of Naval Intelligence, who will speak to the Navy's Unidentified Aerial Phenomenon Task Force, which laid the foundation for the efforts we will discuss today. First, I'd like to thank Congress for supporting the Department's UAP efforts. The NDAA for fiscal year 2022 has helped us to establish a dedicated office to oversee processes and procedures for the timely collection, processing, analysis, and reporting of UAP-related data. What are UAP? Put simply, UAP are airborne objects that, when encountered, cannot be immediately identified. However, it is the Department's contention that by combining appropriately structured, collected data with rigorous scientific analysis, any object that we encounter can likely be isolated, characterized, identified, and if necessary, mitigated. We know that our service members have encountered unidentified aerial phenomena, and because UAPs pose potential flight safety and general security risks, we are committed to a focused effort to determine their origins. Our effort will include the thorough examination of adversarial platforms and potential breakthrough technologies, U.S. government or commercial platforms, allied or partner systems, and other natural phenomena. We also understand that there has been a cultural stigma surrounding UAP. Our goal is to eliminate the stigma by fully incorporating our operators and mission personnel into a standardized data gathering process. We believe that making UAP reporting a mission imperative will be instrumental to the effort's success. The Defense Intelligence and Security Enterprise provides real-time support to our warfighters and mission personnel across all domains. To optimize the Department's UAP work, we are establishing an office within the Office of the Secretary of Defense. That office's function is clear: to facilitate the identification of previously unknown or unidentified airborne objects in a methodical, logical, and standardized manner. These goals will ensure that we are working closely with operational personnel on training and reporting requirements, developing data and intelligence requirements, standardizing and integrating processes and procedures for collection, operational surveillance, analysis, and reporting, leveraging our research and development capabilities to improve detection, characterization, and identification of UAPs, developing mitigating solutions and procedures, and identifying strategy and policy solutions. This effort will maximize collaboration and build upon already existing relationships with the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, the FAA, DHS, and the FBI. We are also committed to strong partnerships with the Department of Energy, NOAA, the DEA, NASA, and the national labs, and just as importantly, our international partners and allies. With regard to the importance of transparency, the Department is fully committed to the principle of openness and accountability to the American people. However, we are also mindful of our obligation to protect sensitive sources and methods. Our goal is to strike that delicate balance, one that enables us to maintain the public's trust while preserving those capabilities that are vital to the support of our service personnel. In closing, the Department is committed to this effort and welcomes the challenge. We thank you for your committed support and look forward to your questions.
Chairman Schiff, Chairman Carson, Ranking Member Crawford, and committee members, thank you very much for the opportunity to be here today to highlight the ongoing work of the Department of Defense regarding unidentified aerial phenomena. Since the early 2000s, we have seen an increasing number of unauthorized and or unidentified aircraft or objects in military-controlled training areas and training ranges and other designated airspace. Reports of sightings are frequent and continuing. We attribute this increase in reporting to a number of factors, including our work to destigmatize reporting, an increase in the number of new systems such as quadcopters and unmanned aerial systems that are in our airspace, identification of what we can classify as clutter, mylar balloons and other types of air trash, and improvements in the capabilities of our various sensors to detect things in our airspace. Almost 2 years ago, in August of 2020, Deputy Secretary of Defense Nordquist directed the establishment of the Unidentified Aerial Phenomena Task Force within the Department of the Navy. The UAP Task Force was built on the foundation of the Navy's initial efforts to respond to the reports from our aviators on unidentified objects observed in our training ranges. The basic issues then and now are twofold. First, Incursions in our training ranges by unidentified objects represent serious hazards to safety of flight. In every aspect of naval aviation, safety of our aircrews is paramount. Second, intrusions by unknown aircraft or objects pose potential threats to the security of our operations. Our aviators train as they would fight. So any intrusions that may compromise the security of our operations by revealing our capabilities, our tactics, techniques, or procedures are of great concern to the Navy and the Department of Defense. From the very beginning, we took these reports very seriously. We instituted a data-driven approach to the investigations where we could collect as much data as possible and use all available resources to analyze and make informed decisions on the best ways to address our findings. Our main objective was to transition UAP efforts from an anecdotal or narrative-based approach to a rigorous science and technology engineering-focused study. This data-driven approach requires input from a wide variety of sources. In the early stages, the task force worked to standardize the reporting mechanisms and processes to make it as easy as possible for personnel to report any engagement so that we were getting that wide range of reporting that we needed. We also spent considerable efforts engaging directly with our naval aviators and building relationships to help destigmatize the act of reporting sightings or encounters. And we worked with naval aviation leadership to provide additional equipment to record any encounter. Navy and Air Force crews now have step-by-step procedures for reporting on a UAP on their knee board in the cockpit and in their post-flight debrief procedures. The direct result of those efforts has been increased reporting with increased opportunities to focus a number of sensors on any objects. The message is now clear. If you see something, you need to report it. And the message has been received. In fact, recently, I received a call from a senior naval aviator with over 2,000 flight hours. He called me personally from the flight line after landing to talk about an encounter that he had just experienced. Those were just the initial steps. We also made a concerted effort to assemble subject matter experts from across the Department of Defense and the intelligence community and other U.S. government agencies and departments. We forged partnerships with the research, development, and acquisition communities, with industry partners, and with academic research labs, and we brought many allies and international partners into our discussions on UAP. Additionally, subject matter experts from a wide variety of fields, including physics, optics, metallurgy, meteorology, just to name a few, have been brought in to expand our understanding in areas where we may not have organic expertise. In short, we've endeavored to bring an all-hands-on-deck approach to better understand this phenomena. So what have we learned so far? Any given observation may be fleeting or longer. It may be recorded or not. It may be observable by one or multiple assets. In short, there's rarely an easy answer. For example, let me share with you the first video that we have here today, which shows an observation in real time. There it was. That's, in many cases, that's all that a report may include. And in many other cases, we have far less than this. As we detailed in both the unclassified and classified versions of the preliminary assessment released by the Office of the Director of National Intelligence last June, this often limited amount of high-quality data and reporting hampers our ability to draw firm conclusions about the nature or intent of UAP. As detailed in the ODNI report, if and when individual UAP incidents are resolved, they likely fall into one of 5 potential explanatory categories: airborne clutter, natural atmospheric phenomena, U.S. government or U.S. industry developmental programs, foreign adversary systems, or a other bin that allows for a holding bin of difficult cases and for the possibility of surprise and potential scientific discovery. We stand by those initial results. Since the release of that preliminary report, the UAP Task Force database has now grown to contain approximately 400 reports. The stigma has been reduced. We've also made progress in resolving the character of a limited number of UAP encounters. For example, let me show you a couple of another video and image taken years apart in different areas. In this video, U.S. Navy personnel recorded what appears to be triangles, some flashing, recorded several years ago, off the coast of the United States. This was recorded while the U.S. Navy ship observed a number of small unmanned aerial systems in the area. And importantly, the video was taken through night vision goggles with a single lens reflex camera. These remained unresolved for several years. Several years later, and off a different coast, U.S. Navy personnel, again in a swarm of unmanned aerial systems, and again through night vision goggles and an SLR camera, recorded this image. But this time, other U.S. Navy assets also observed unmanned aerial systems nearby, and we're now reasonably confident that these triangles correlate to unmanned aerial systems in the area. The triangular appearance is a result of light passing through the night vision goggles and then being recorded by an SLR camera. Now, I don't mean to suggest that everything that we observe is identifiable, but this is a great example of how it takes considerable effort to understand what we're seeing in the examples that we are able to collect. In this example, we accumulated sufficient data from 2 similar encounters from 2 different time periods in 2 different geographic areas to help us draw these conclusions. That's not always the case, though. We recognize that that can be unsatisfying or insufficient in the eyes of many. This is a popular topic in our nation, with various theories as to what these objects may be and where they originate. By nature, we are all curious and we seek to understand the unknown. And as a lifelong intelligence professional, I'm impatient. I want immediate explanations for this as much as anyone else. However, understanding can take significant time and effort. It's why we've endeavored to concentrate on this data-driven process to derive fact-based results. And given the nature of our business, national defense, we've had to sometimes be less forthcoming with information in open forums than many would hope. If UAP do indeed represent a potential threat to our security, then the capabilities, systems, processes, and sources we use to observe, record, study, or analyze these phenomena need to be classified at appropriate levels. We do not want potential adversaries to know exactly what we're able to see or understand, or how we come to the conclusions we make. Therefore, public disclosures must be carefully considered on a case-by-case basis. So what's next? We're concentrating on a seamless transition to the new organization. And future analysis of complicated issues of UAP issues will greatly benefit from the infrastructure, the process, and the procedures that we've developed to date. I'm confident that the task force, under Navy leadership, has forged a path forward that will allow us to anchor assessments in science and engineering via anecdotal evidence. We remain committed to that goal, as I know the USDI organization does as well. So thank you very much for your interest and continuing support for the UAP Task Force. The team's made a lot of progress, but we really are just establishing the foundation for the more detailed analysis that's yet to be done. And with your continued support, we can sustain that momentum necessary to produce data-centric analysis and understanding of the phenomena. I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Bray. This is the 3rd version of this task force, and to be frank, one of Congress's concerns is that the executive branch in administration from both parties has been sweeping concerns about UAPs under the rug by focusing on events that can be explained and avoiding events that cannot be explained. What can you say to give the American people confidence that you aren't just focusing our attention on low-hanging fruit with easy explanations?
Congressman, I'll start, and then Mr. Bray, please feel free to weigh in. So the way that we're approaching this is with a more thorough, standardized methodology than what we have in the past. First and foremost, the Secretary of Defense is chartering this effort. This is not someone lower in the Department of Defense. And he has assigned that task to the Office of Secretary of Defense, the Undersecretary for Intelligence and Security, that's me, because I'm responsible for looking at intelligence matters, I'm responsible for security matters. This is potentially both. So when you start concerning ourselves with the safety of our personnel, the safety of our installations and bases, there's no other higher priority than what we have than actually getting after this. And as you have stated, we have been assigned that task to actually stand up an office, the AIM-SOG, which I believe the name, sir, will likely change. But we have moved forward in terms of moving to establish that office. We have, as of this week, picked a director for that effort, a very established and accomplished individual. We've identified spaces. We've worked with personnel across the Department of Defense, with the services, and we've worked with the IC, which is on board in helping us work through this standardized methodology for now, bringing in data, analyzing that data, and reporting that data in the appropriate method and appropriate means so we can either get it to our service personnel to ensure their safety, or get it to you and the Congress and to the public to ensure that you have oversight to what we're doing. So, chartered by the Secretary of Defense, standardized, and really a methodical approach is something that we're doing that has not been done before.
Can we get some kinds of assurances that your analysts will follow the facts where they lead and assess all hypotheses?
Absolutely. So we're open to all hypotheses. We're open to any conclusions that we may encounter.
Quickly, before I pass it to the ranking member and Chairman Schiff, I want to thank you both for taking the time, and I had a good time meeting with you last week, Director Moultrie, Undersecretary Moultrie. It's fair to say that you are a science fiction fan, is that correct?
It is fair to say that I am an inquisitive mind who has spent 40 years in the intelligence field and has focused on both science and science fiction. That is fair.
Could you tell us about it?
Yeah, well, yeah, look, my generation grew up looking at space sagas and the Apollo program. So all of us who grew up in the 60s were just thrilled by watching our first astronaut land on the moon. That was a momentous occasion. To people who were of different generations, some of them didn't believe that it happened. I still have relatives and friends who don't believe it happened, right? Science fiction to them. But to us, it was, no, that's the progress that we've made. And so I was enthralled by that, and I've taken that to heart. I enjoy the challenge of what may be out there. I have mentioned to you that, yes, I have followed science fiction. I have gone to conventions, even. I'll say it on the record. Got to break the ice somehow. But, you know, I have done that, right? But there's nothing wrong with that. Don't necessarily dress up, but I do, you know, I do believe that it's important to show that the Department of Defense has, you know, we have character, and we're people just like you, just like the American people. We have our inquisitiveness. We have our questions. We want to know what's out there as much as you want to know what's out there. We get the questions not just from you, we get it from family members. And we get them night and day, not just in committee hearings. So finding what's out there is important. But first and foremost, it's important for us to do that so that we can ensure that our people, our personnel, our aviators, our bases and installations are safe. And then that curiosity factor is something else that we just want to know, because that's the human race. It's just, you know, that insatiable desire to know.
Thank you, sir. Ranking Member Crawford.
Mr. Moultrie, you said you don't necessarily dress up. That wasn't a real strong statement. Gentlemen, thank you for being here today. We appreciate it. And thank you, Mr. Moultrie, for breaking the ice the way you did. Appreciate that. The inability to understand objects in our sensitive operating areas is tantamount to an intelligence failure that we certainly want to avoid. This is not about finding alien spacecraft, but about delivering dominant intelligence across the tactical, operational, and strategic spectrum. So my question is, how can AIM-SOG lead to prevention of intelligence surprises?
Sure, I'll start with that. So the goal of our effort is to integrate it into what we already do on a normal basis, which is look for the unknowns, Congressman, as you stated in your opening remarks, across all domains. So we've been doing this for decades. We've been looking at the space domain, looking at space objects, looking at space weather, looking at space phenomenon. We've been looking at things in the air domain, and we, as you know, and I'll talk more about this in classified session, but we have a very concerted effort to understand adversarial platforms and adversarial developmental programs. And we do that also in the ground domain. And of course, we're very interested in what happens in the underwater or sea domain, if you will, subsurface domain. So if there are objects that our aviators or air crews are encountering in this air domain, and their sensors are discovering or detecting some of these objects, we want to just bring that in to the normal process that we have for identifying unknown unknowns. We want to make sure we have the intelligence requirements that allow us not only to look at that event from the time that it occurs forward, but maybe retrospectively we want to go back and see if we can get to the left of that event to say, was there some developmental program that we, to get to your technical surprise issue, sir, that we should have known about? And if so, how do we put that intelligence requirement in place to ensure that we are following an adversarial development or any other development that may be out there? So that's what we want to do in terms of normalizing this and bringing it into the normal process of how we identify unknown unknowns.
So you mentioned fidelity, and I think it's important to talk about the relationship from the Navy as the lead agency on this. How do you interact with Space Force, Air Force to create that degree of fidelity? We're talking about sensors and so on, and I guess where I have some concerns that many of the images that we see commonly in this committee and even in open source, the resolution and the clarity that would allow a robust technical intelligence analysis is challenging. So is AIMSOC prepared to address the quality and quantity of data collected on UAP to advance intelligence collection, and do you have the adequate sensors you need to collect that high-quality data?
One of the lines of effort that we have is looking at our sensor capabilities and to understand whether or not, as the video showed that Mr. Bray displayed, sometimes it's very fleeting data that we have on some of these objects. And we want to make sure that, one, our systems are calibrated to actually be able to collect on the objects. You know, our sensors today they're calibrated for specific things. We want to make sure they're calibrated for things of this nature, things of this size, things of this velocity, if I can use that term. We want to make sure that once we have that data is stored in some standardized method that we can then extract and that we can feed into our system real time. So we do not want this to take some prolonged period of time for us to get that data. But our goal is absolutely to have that high fidelity information that we get from all sensors, and we want to be able to integrate that with what we may have off of ground-based sensors. So whatever we may have on a platform, whatever we may have on the ground, whatever we may have from other sensors that we may have in different domains, we want to be able to integrate that all and get this integrated picture as we would, as I said, with any other unidentified objects or things that we are tracking as a part of our normal intelligence responsibilities.
Thank you. Last question, Mr. Bray, if you would. I'm a Navy pilot. I've encountered a UAP. Walk me through the reporting protocol once I see something that I think needs reported.
The first thing that aviator would do after landing as a part of their normal debriefing is they would contact their intelligence officer. Their intelligence officer would then walk them through first filing a, data preservation to ensure that, that whatever sensor data may be on the aircraft, that we preserve that so that it's available for later analysis. Second, they would actually fill out a form that includes details like where they were operating, altitudes they were operating, speeds, what they observed, whatever sensor data they may have recorded from that. And then that report is filed. It goes two places. One, it goes through the operational chain of command, so that operational units are aware of what's being observed, and also to the UAP task force, so that they can take that data, database it, and quite often have individuals from the task force contact the aviator and ask them additional questions if there were things that weren't clear in the report. That then goes into a database where we begin to compare it with other observations that we have, again, comparing for locations, comparing for altitudes, speeds, shapes, if any RF emissions were detected from the platform, all of that, so that we can try to reach some conclusions on that.
Thank you. Yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Chairman Schiff.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Bray, can you rerun that first image? It looked like it was outside of a plane window. And if you wouldn't mind going up to the screen and tell us what we're seeing. Not that you can necessarily tell us what we're seeing, but
Right.
explain what we should be looking at in that first image.
Absolutely. And Alexi, what I'll ask is if you can stop it at a certain point.
And are we looking outside of a civilian aircraft window? Is that what we're looking at?
You're looking outside a U.S. Navy F-18.
Okay.
Great, shows how difficult the analysis is. Go just a little farther forward. What you'll find eventually on this, when we find the right frame, is for literally about one frame here is a spherical object that passes right through here, passes right through there because the aircraft is moving pretty fast in this direction with the flyby of it. And it is a,
Is that it right there?
that is it. There we go, off in the distance.
Can you point to the screen again what we're supposed to be looking at?
Is right.
Okay, if you could stop that frame.
That's not the one.
No, it's not the one.
Alexi, just push play. Let's see if. Here's what you'll see coming up right here is there it went. Now back up just a spherical object right here. It zooms by the window right in this area right there. There we go. Could you see that part right there again going by? I think we're having a hard time stopping it in the right spot.
Okay.
So as you can see, it's difficult, and I think a part of the issue here is the laptop we're working with is not as easy for stopping that video in the right spot.
We'll describe what we have seen in that. What are we observing?
What you see here is aircraft that is operating in a U.S. Navy training range that has observed spherical object in that area, and as they fly by it, they take a video. You see it looks reflective in this video, somewhat reflective, and it quickly passes by the cockpit of the aircraft.
And is this one of the phenomena that we can't explain?
I do not have an explanation for what this specific object is.
And is this one of the situations where it is, that's the object that we're looking at right there? Thank you. And is this a situation where it was observed by the pilot and it was also recorded by the aircraft's instruments?
We'll talk about the multi-sensor part in a later session. But in this case, we have at least that.
In the Director of National Intelligence 2021 unclassified report, the ODNI reported 144 UAPs between 2004 and 2021, 80% of which were recorded on multiple instruments. And I take it, with respect to some of those, you had a pilot seeing them if it was observed by a pilot,
right,
and you had multiple instruments recording it. So you really have three sensors, the human sensor and two technical sensors detecting the object, is that?
For the majority of incidents that we had in the last year's report, the majority had multi-sensor data. When I talk about the 400 reports that we have now, that number will certainly go down because a lot of those new reports that we have are actually historic reports that are narrative-based. So that percentage will go down just as a factor of the fact that the destigmatization has resulted in more narrative reports.
And that's the object we're looking at right there now, right?
That's it right there.
Okay. Last year's report also said that of those 144, 18 of them reportedly appeared to exhibit unusual flight characteristics, appear to demonstrate advanced technology, and some of them appeared to remain stationary in winds aloft, move against the wind, maneuver abruptly, or move at considerable speed without discernible means of propulsion. That's pretty intriguing. And if you're able to answer this in this setting, are we aware of any foreign adversary capable of moving objects without any discernible means of propulsion?
I think I would, without discernible means of propulsion, I would say that we're not aware of any adversary that can move an object without discernible means of propulsion. The question then becomes, in many of these cases where we don't have a discernible mean of propulsion in the data that we have, in some cases there is likely sensor artifacts that may be hiding some of that. There's certainly some degree of something that looks like signature management that we have seen from some of these UAP, but I would caution. I would simply say that there are a number of events in which we do not have an explanation, and there are a small handful in which there are flight characteristics or signature management that we can't explain with the data that we have. We'll continue. Those are obviously the ones that are of most interest to us. Earlier, when we asked about how you avoid technological surprise, the biggest way you avoid technological surprise is by collecting this type of data and by, importantly, calibrating the assumptions that you go into with how you do that analysis. I'll tell you, within the UAP Task Force, we have one basic assumption, and that is that generally speaking, our sensors operate as designed. And we make that assumption because many times these are multi-sensor collections. We make no assumptions about the origin of this or that there may or may not be some sort of technology that we don't understand. That's, I think, the key to avoiding technological surprises, by calibrating those assumptions.
And finally, with respect to the second two videos showing the small triangles, the hypothesis is that those are commercial drones that, because of the use of night vision goggles, appear like triangles. Is that the operating assessment?
Some type of drone, some type of unmanned aerial system, and it is simply that light source resolves itself through the night vision goggles onto the SLR camera as a triangle.
And have we, in order to prove that hypothesis, flown a drone and observed it with that same technology to see whether we can reproduce the effect?
The UAP Task Force is aware of studies that have done that.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Dr. Winstrup.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all for being here. My first question is, through this process where there's been sightings, have the sightings been stationary, or have they always been sighted from a moving object, from a plane or a ship that may be moving? Have these reports ever come from a stationary object being observed in the sky?
The UAP Task Force does have reports from stationary, reports from a stationary observer.
Because there's a difference observing something when you're moving as
Right.
well. It's physics, right? So that's
Right.
why I asked that question. Are we capable, or have we made any breakthroughs, or anyone made any breakthroughs, to be able to cite something and make some determination at all of its composition, whether it's a solid or a gas? Is there any such capability?
From
Not asking what, I'm just.
Right. From some of the returns, I mean, it's clear that that the majority, well, it's clear that many of the observations we have are physical objects from the sensor data that we have.
Well, gas is physical, is a physical object. It can be, and so, and you see where I'm going with this. I'm trying to determine what it is we're looking at. So if we can decide if something is a solid or a gas, and if there have been any conclusion on its capabilities, like its capabilities of movement, of turning, going, 180 degrees or 90-degree turn, anything along that line that we've been able to determine.
Within the, and again, I should point out that, that there is not a single explanation for UAP. There are a lot of different things that are unidentified aerial phenomena.
Basically, we really don't know much on that. That's all I'm trying to get at. And I'm pleased that you have protocol right now for our military, but are there any non-military reports coming forward of similar events, or is it all coming from military?
The UAP Task Force has a very good working relationship with the FAA. They have very good working relationship with other parts of the U.S. government so that we can ingest reports from
Do we have
from
any
those sources.
reports non-military?
Yes.
Thank you. That's my question. And do we need to put out protocol for civilians that may be in that arena, like through FAA? Do you think that would be appropriate and helpful?
I think standardized reporting, without a doubt, is key to helping us get to ascertain what some of these are.
I think it would be important as well. There are other people besides the U.S. that have had these experiences and reported them? Is that correct?
There are, that's correct.
Is it all of our allies, or is it allies and adversaries? What have we learned publicly?
So some of that, I think, sir, we'll save for closed session.
Well, that goes to my next question. Publicly, have others made anything which would not have to be considered closed? I don't want you to answer what they've said necessarily.
Allies have seen these. China has established its own version of a UAP task force, so clearly a number of countries have observations of things in the airspace that they can't identify.
And do we share data with some, with all? Are they sharing with us?
We share data with some, and some share data with us.
But not necessarily all that have publicly reported something?
That's correct.
Okay. And I think that's an important thing, and for the other session, actually, that we don't discuss that now. Because, obviously something like this can be a national security challenge for us, no doubt about it. If they're developed by an adversary through some breakthrough technology, they can be very disruptive to our military actions, or at least serve as a distraction. And so my caution would be careful who we share our data with, and don't necessarily trust some of the data we may get from someone else. And with that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Mr. Himes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. One of the objectives of this open hearing is to try to erode some of the stigma that attaches to, in particular, our military men and women reporting this. It's obviously really very serious because should one of our adversaries have developed a technology that we don't know about it, we need to know about it yesterday. And obviously, any sort of stigma that prevents our military from reporting this data as comprehensively as possible as a national security threat. So I really just have two questions in the service of that goal. The first is, the chairman asked that we run that video again. Most people, when they see a video, we're all used to seeing things from a car, seeing things from a sidewalk. Very few people have the experience of observing something through night vision goggles at Mach 1.5. So just talk for a minute about, if you would, whichever of you is most appropriate, how radically different observation is at high speed and 3-dimension than it is for most of us who walk around and drive cars.
So the first thing I think that's important to note about this is there are lots of things when you are moving very fast and an object is between you and a stationary reference point like the ground, it gives a lot of different impressions about how quickly something is or isn't moving. And it actually means that it is a challenge, especially with narrative-based data, to get a lot of information on that. That's why the sensor data is so important, because things do happen very quickly, as you see there. And sometimes things that happen very quickly, something may be moving very slow. That aircraft is moving quite fast. How fast that object is moving that goes by is probably very slow.
So I guess my point is that an observation, either a visual observation or a electronic observation, infrared or whatever, looks radically different than it does to most people. Even instruments are on gimbals and that sort of thing, so that creates a very unusual view to, again, those of us who are used to seeing things in 2 dimensions largely. And second question. I think, Mr. Bray, you said something that I want to unpack a little bit. A number of these UAPs, you said, we can't explain. Again, in the service of sort of reducing speculation and conspiracy theories, we can't explain can range from a visual observation that was distant on a foggy night, we don't know what it is, to we've found an organic material that we can't identify, right? Those are radically different worlds. So when you say we can't explain, give the public a little bit better sense of where on that spectrum of we can't explain we are. Are we holding materials, organic or inorganic, that we don't know about? Are we, picking up emanations that are something other than light or infrared that could be deemed to be communications? Give us a sense for what you mean when you say we can't explain.
Sure. When I say we can't explain, I mean exactly as you described there, that there is a lot of information, like the video that we showed, in which there's simply too little data to create a reasonable explanation. There are a small handful of cases in which we have more data that our analysis simply hasn't been able to fully pull together a picture of what happened. And those are the cases where we talk about where we see some indications of flight characteristics or signature management that are not what we had expected. When it comes to material that we have no material. We have detected no emanations within the UAP task force that would suggest it's anything non-terrestrial in origin. So there's, when I say unexplained, I mean everything from too little data to the data that we have doesn't point us towards an explanation, but we'll go wherever the data takes us. Again, we've made no assumptions about what this is or isn't. We're committed to understanding these, and so we'll go wherever that data takes us.
Thank you. That's very helpful, and so I think it bears emphasis. When you say we can't explain, everything that you can't explain is in a bucket called data. Is that correct? And that would mean data collected by sensors, visual observations, everything that we can't explain, quote unquote, is in a bucket called data.
Right. A narrative report from the early 2000s, if it just had a little bit of information on it, would be in our database and it would be unresolved.
I would add to that, it's insufficient data. I mean, that's one of the challenges we have. Insufficient data either on the event itself, the object itself, or insufficient data or plug-in with some other organization or agency that may have had something in that space at that time. So it's a data issue that we're facing in many of these instances, Congressman.
Understood. Thank you very much. Yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Mr. Gallagher.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for allowing me to join this hearing. I really appreciate the witness's testimony. Mr. Moultrie, as the chairman mentioned, DoD had an initiative to study UFOs in the 1960s called Project Blue Book. It's also been well reported in our briefing and in other places that we have more recent projects, specifically ATIP. Could you describe any other initiatives that the DoD or DoD contractors have managed after Project Blue Book ended and prior to ATIP beginning? Did anything also predate Project Blue Book?
So I can't speak to what may have predated Project Blue Book. I mean, of course, there's Roswell and all these other things that people have talked about over the years. I'm familiar with Blue Book. I'm familiar with ATIP. I haven't seen other documented studies that have been done by DoD in that regard.
So you're not aware of anything in between Project Blue Book and ATIP?
I'm not aware of anything that's official that was done in between those two. Okay. Hasn't been brought to my attention.
Okay. Additionally, are you aware of any other DoD or DoD contract programs focused on UAPs from a technological engineering perspective? And by that I mean, are you aware of any technology initiatives focused on this topic other than initiatives focused on the individual case investigations?
I'm not aware of any contractual programs that are focused on anything related to this other than what we are doing in the Navy Task Force and what we are about to launch in terms of our effort.
Same question for you, Mr. Bray.
Same answer, not aware of anything outside what we are doing in the UAP Task Force.
So just to confirm, you're not aware of any technology or engineering resources that have been focused on these efforts besides what we've mentioned today?
Once again, I'll say no contractual or programmatic efforts that are involved. And the reason why I qualify it that way, let me qualify it that way. I can't speak to what people may be looking at in the department. Somebody says, I'm looking at something that may be unidentified, and I can't speak to that. I speak to official programs that we have on the record.
It's also been reported that there have been UAP observed and interacting with and flying over sensitive military facilities, particularly, and not just ranges, but some facilities housing our strategic nuclear forces. One such incident allegedly occurred at Malmstrom Air Force Base, in which 10 of our nuclear ICBMs were rendered inoperable. At the same time, a glowing red orb was observed overhead. I'm not commenting on the accuracy of this. I'm simply asking you whether you're aware of it and whether you have any comment on the accuracy of that report.
Let me pass that to Mr. Bray, if you've been looking at UAPs over the last 3 years.
That data is not within the holdings of the UAP Task Force.
Okay, but are you aware of the report, or that the data exists somewhere?
I have heard stories. I have not seen the official data on that.
So you've just seen informal stories, no official assessment that you've done or exists within DoD that you're aware of regarding the Malmstrom incident?
All I can speak to is what's within my cognizance of the UAP Task Force, and we have not looked at that incident.
Well, I would say, it's a pretty high-profile incident. I don't claim to be an expert on this, but that's out there in the ether. You're the guys investigating it. I mean, who else is doing it?
If something was officially brought to our attention, we would look at it. There are many things that are out there in the ether that aren't officially brought to our attention.
So how would it have to be officially brought to your attention? I'm bringing it to your attention.
Sure, so,
this is pretty official.
Sure. So we'll go back and take a look at it, but generally there is some authoritative figure that says there is an incident that occurred. We'd like you to look at this. But in terms of just tracking what may be in the media that says that something occurred at this time, at this place, there are probably a lot of leads that we would have to follow up on. I don't think we are resourced to do that right now.
Well, I don't claim to be an authoritative figure, but for what it's worth, I would like you to look into it. And
sure.
If for no other reason, you could dismiss it and say this is not worth wasting resources on.
Will do.
And then finally, are you aware of a document that appeared around 2019, sometimes called the Admiral Wilson Memo or EW Notes Memo?
I am not.
You're not.
Are you tracking?
I'm not personally aware of that.
Okay. This is a document in which, again, I'm not commenting on the veracity. I was hoping you would help me with that, in which a former head of DIA claims to have had a conversation with the Dr. Eric Wilson and claims to have sort of been made aware of certain contractors or DoD programs that he tried to get fuller access to and was denied access to. So you're not aware of that?
I'm not aware, Congressman.
In my 10 seconds remaining, then, I guess I just would ask, Mr. Chairman, unanimous consent to enter that memo into the record.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate it.
Mr. Krishnamurthy.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to both of you for appearing today and for your public service. First question is, there have been no collisions between any U.S. assets in one of these UAPs, correct?
We have not had a collision. We've had at least 11 near misses, though.
And maybe we'll talk about those 11 near misses or any place where there's close proximity. I assume, or tell me if I'm wrong, there's been no attempt, there's no communications or any kind of communication signals that emanate from those objects that we've detected, correct?
That's correct.
And have we attempted to communicate with those objects?
No.
So we don't even put out a alert saying, U.S. Identify yourself. You are, within our flight path or something like that. We haven't said anything like that.
We've not put anything out like that. Generally speaking, for example, in the video that we showed earlier, it appears to be something that is, unmanned, appears to be something that may or may not be in controlled flight, and so we've not attempted any communication with that.
Okay, so, and I assume we've never discharged any armaments against a UAP, correct?
That's correct.
How about wreckage? Have we come across any wreckage of any kind of object that has now been examined by you?
The UAP task force doesn't have any wreckage that isn't explainable, that isn't consistent with being of terrestrial origin.
Do we have any sensors underwater to detect on submerged UAPs? Anything that is in the ocean or in the seas?
So I think that would be more appropriately addressed in closed session, sir.
Okay. I think one of the biggest questions that I have is, we say with a lot of probability, we say they, quote unquote, probably do represent physical objects, close quote. When we say probably, is that because we cannot conclusively say that they are physical objects?
In the task force report, when I say probably represent physical objects, most of them represent physical objects. There could be some that are more of a meteorological phenomena, something like that, that may not be a physical object in the sense that most people think of something you could go up and touch.
But the ones where you say most of them represent physical objects, can you say that they are definitely, like with 100% certainty, that they are physical objects?
I can say with certainty that a number of these are physical objects.
Okay, so we can't rule out that some of them may not be physical objects.
So, some certainly could be a sensor anomaly or something like that. Some could be.
Now, how about with regard to UAPs? We've talked about UAPs on training areas, but obviously there's some sensor bias. I would think we put sensors in training areas. How about with regard to non-training areas? Do we track what's in open source and what civilians and others have tracked? And have we found similarities to what they've observed in terms of UAPs in non-training areas to the ones that are in training areas?
The UAP task force has worked very hard to make sure the data set that we're working with is a data set that we have very good control over that data. So we have some partnerships with FAA so that we get some of that, so we get that reporting in. But if it comes to just open source reports or someone says that they saw something, that generally does not make it into our database.
So basically, it sounds like we have a good partnership with FAA, but apart from FAA, we don't have partnerships with other agencies or other entities that might be tracking so that we could enlarge our data set to make comparisons.
So we will. So that's the goal of this next effort, will be to expand that relationship with the rest of government and the interagency, so we can understand what they're seeing, what we're seeing. We can correlate on each other's holdings
Because
and
I
hopefully
think,
resolve this.
sorry to interrupt, but I think that we're we might have a bias right now going on with regard to just reporting on UAPs being in training areas when we don't really track what's happening elsewhere. Last question, have our encounters with UAPs altered the development of either our offensive or defensive capabilities or even our sensor capabilities?
We'd save that for the closed session.
Okay, great, thank you.
Mr. LaHood.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and want to thank the witnesses for being here today. Obviously, this topic of UAPs has attracted a lot of interest in people that are curious about this hearing today. As we talk about, and I would say there's a lot of what I would call amateur interest groups that are involved in the UAP field. My question is, when there are unsubstantiated claims or manufactured claims of UAPs or kind of false information that's put out there, what are the consequences for people that are involved with that or groups that are involved with that?
So one of the concerns that we have is that there are a lot of individuals and groups that are putting information out there that that could be considered to be somewhat self-serving. We're trying to do what's in the best interest of, one, the Department of Defense, and then two, what's in the best interest of the public, to ensure that we can put factual-based information back into the mainstream and back into the bloodstream of the reporting media that we have, so people understand what's there. It's important because we are attempting, as this hearing has drawn out, to understand, one, what may just be natural phenomenon, two, what may be sensor phenomenology or things that were happening with sensors, three, what may be legitimate counterintelligence threats to places that we have or bases or installations, or security threats to our platforms. And anything that diverts us off of what we have with the resources that have been allocated to us, send us off in these spurious chases and hunts that are just not helpful. And they also they also contribute to the undermining of the confidence that the Congress and the American people have that we are trying to get to the root cause of what's happening here, report on that, and then feed that back into our national security apparatus so we are able to protect the American people and our allies. So it is harmful, it is hurtful, but hopefully if we get more information out there, we'll start to lessen the impact of some of those spurious reports.
So just taking that a step further, so that misinformation, false narratives, manufactured, so what are the consequences? Are there legal consequences? Are there examples that you can give us where people have been held accountable by this misinformation or disinformation?
I can't give you, any examples where somebody's been legally held liable for putting something out there, but...
Well, I guess what's the deterrent from people engaging in this activity?
I don't know. I don't have that answer. That's something that, welcome the dialogue with Congress to talk about that with the members who, help legislate those laws to say what should be the legal ramifications that we could use to potentially hold individuals accountable, whether it be citizens or information that might be injected into our media by other forces or other countries, if you will.
And in terms of DOD's review and analysis in this field, I mean, is there a standard in place when it comes to UAPs? I mean, is there any guidance you look to that's codified in law or otherwise within DOD that kind of sets out the standards for UAPs and what to look for?
I think that's part of what the group that we're standing up now will be chartered to do. We're actually, from my organization, we'll be looking at policy and standards that we have to come to you and work with you to actually put in place and promulgate across our government.
Thank you. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Mr. Welch.
Thank you. I'm going to follow on the line of questions from Mr. LaHood. Gentlemen, what seems incredibly difficult for you is that there's two almost competing but different narratives. One is no one knows whether there's extraterrestrial life. It's a big universe, and it would be pretty presumptuous to have a hard and fast conclusion. And then if there is, it's not beyond the realm of possibility that there is some exploration coming here. And that underlies a lot of the reports you get. I think Mr. LaHood was asking about that. People think there must be extraterrestrial life, and it's not at all beyond the pale that there would be a visit here. On the other hand, as the DoD, you have the responsibility to make sure that our national security is protected, and that if there are surveillance drones or active drones that can disable our systems, that has to be analyzed, has to be stopped. So how do you divide how do you separate your responsibilities where you get all these reports from folks who maybe in good faith, maybe not, believe that you should be investigating every possible report of a extraterrestrial incident? I'll start with you, Mr. Moultrie.
Sure, indeed, Congressman, and thank you for the question. It's important that we, as a part of this effort, really build out the relationship that we have with others, including NASA, and for the reasons that you just pointed out. So there are elements in our government that are engaged in looking for life in other places, and they have been doing that for decades, right? They've been searching for extraterrestrial life. There are astrobiologists who have been doing this too. We're a part of that same government, and so our goal is not to potentially cover up something if we were to find something. It's to understand what may be out there, examine what it may mean for us, if there are any, from a defense perspective, any national security implications or ramifications, but then to work with organizations as appropriate, if it's a weather phenomenology with NOAA, if it's a potential for extraterrestrial life or an indication of extraterrestrial life, with someone like NASA.
So the transparency actually is very important.
Completely.
For public consumption.
Completely.
But we're going to have a classified briefing, and without going into the details of what kinds of secrets that we can't share here, what is it, what are we protecting? I don't know if you can answer this question in this open forum, but in fact, your perception of what it is we have to, quote, protect.
So I think right now what's really important for us to protect is how we know certain things. So there are a lot of things that we know, whether it be about the thinking of other leaders around the world, the weapon systems that are being developed, or how we detect things that may be threats to us. Many of those things are the result of some of our most sensitive sources and methods, and we'll use those things not just for this effort, but those same sources and methods are used to help protect us from adversaries and from others who might mean to do us harm. There aren't separate UAP sensors. There's not a separate UAP processing computer. There's not a separate UAP dissemination chain or whatever. So it's the same process. It's just the same system that we have that helps us do all that. We need to protect that because this is something that we're looking at, but we're sure there are going to be other things that we'll look at in the future that will need those same sensors, we'll need those same sources and methods to help us do. So we're protecting the fact of that this nation has developed capabilities that enable us to know what may be threats to us and to counter those threats before they become something of a national issue.
Thank you very much. I want to thank both you, Mr. Bray, and you, Mr. Moultrie, for your appearance today. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentlemen, beyond videos, is there a range of other information that the executive branch has that would be valuable to the American people while protecting sources and methods, obviously? The details of individual encounters, including the time, place, and details of an encounter. And does the AIMSOG have a clear and repeatable process for considering public release as part of the process?
Chairman Carson,
and do you commit to building that process if it's not in place?
The UAP Task Force, the security classification guide that the UAP Task Force has been operating under that I approved really was meant to protect those sources and methods and meant to protect any knowledge that an adversary intelligence entity may gain from understanding what we're tracking, how we track it, or when we're tracking it, or if we're not. And so that has been an important piece in the balance between transparency and preserving our warfighting advantage, because the U.S. military does train as it would fight. What I will commit to is, at least for that material that's under my authority as the Deputy Director of Naval Intelligence, for information that we have when it does not involve sources and methods, and when we can, with a reasonable degree of confidence, determine that it does not pose a foreign intelligence or national security threat, and it's within my authority to do so, I commit to declassifying that. So I believe very much in the transparency of this, and we work very hard to balance that with our national security needs.
And I'll just add, Congressman, just over the last 3-4 months, I think that the intelligence community and the national defense apparatus have disclosed more information on various events than it has in probably the previous 10 years. You have our commitment to work closely with the Director of National Intelligence and others in the declassification and downgrading of intel apparatus to ensure that we can get whatever information that we can out to the American people and to the public writ large.
Greatly appreciated, sir. Ranking Member Crawford.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Representative Stefanik is en route, I believe, just real quickly, but in the interim, if I could, if you'll indulge me, I just have a couple of real small questions. One is, do we have an example? Can you cite a specific example of an object that can't be explained as having been human-made or natural?
I mean, the example that I would say that is still unresolved, that I think everyone understands quite well, is the 2004 incident from Nimitz. We have data on that, and it simply remains unresolved. Does not mean it resolves to being something, right, that is easily explainable or well, obviously it resolves to being something that is difficult to explain. But I can't point to something that definitively was not man-made, but I can point to a number of examples in which remain unresolved.
Gotcha. With regard to videos that have appeared in open source channels, for example, the Tic Tac video, does AIMSOG maintain control of videos, and how do you prevent leaks of potentially classified videos or other material?
So the AIMSOG, as we establish that organization, we will have a process for classified and compartmented holdings, and we will find a way of getting positive control over those. We have our sensitive access programs and special access programs that allow us to put what we call SAPs around things, and then there's controlled access programs that allow us to put caps around things. So we'll have that in place. Our goal will be ensuring that we're sharing that with the appropriate analysts and the appropriate exploiters, if you will, who can look at that data too. What we don't want to do is bring something into a DoD database or a DoD holding and then have so many wrappers around it, it's not available to those who really need to look at it and to exploit it. And that's one of the reasons we're establishing relationships with the interagency, with the IC and others to be able to do that, sir. But we will do our best to maintain positive control over the materials that we have within our holdings.
Thank you.
Chairman Schiff.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just going back to the 2021 report, you know, under the category of UAP appear to demonstrate advanced technology, those 18 incidents in which some of the UAP appear to remain stationary, winds aloft, move against the wind, maneuver abruptly, or move at considerable speed without discernible means of propulsion. It goes on to say, in a small number of cases, military aircraft systems processed radio frequency energy associated with UAP sightings. I couldn't tell from that whether that small number of cases was a part of the subset of 18. That is, among the 18 which appeared to move with unusual pattern or flight characteristics, did some of those also emit radio frequency energy?
I would have to check with our UAP task force on that. I believe, without getting into specifics that we can do in the closed session, at least some that we have detected RF emissions from were not behaving oddly otherwise.
And the significance of measuring that radio frequency energy is what? That we suspect that this was some form of aircraft in which there were radio transmissions?
The biggest thing that you're looking for there is any indication of an effort to jam whatever sensors that we may have looking at it.
But I would also add to that radio frequency, as you know, Congressman, is used to control various platforms too. So the fact of emanations coming off of any platform, whether it be a UAV or another platform, could be radio frequency activity related to that entity transmitting out or something transmitting to that platform. And of course, we have a sensitivity with our airborne platforms of picking it up, which is one of the reasons that we try to prevent people from using their cell phones on airplanes and things like that. It's very sensitive to RF emanations. So that's a part of what we'll be looking at in the AIMSOG. What is this? Is this something that we can collect on, and can we start to characterize the signaling environment around the emanations that may be coming off of some of these UAPs?
So that energy then that was recorded could be either an effort to jam, or it could be an effort to control a UAV, or any other communication with that craft.
I would say that's accurate.
Right.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Chairman. As the ODNI report makes clear, one possible explanation for UAPs is that we are detecting U.S. aircraft, either secret air programs or even test prototypes. I won't ask you in this setting, obviously, to describe any secret DoD programs. That said, I do want to make sure the U.S. government isn't chasing its own tail. Firstly, do you have a clear and repeatable process to check with compartmented programs about whether a UAP sighting is attributable to a U.S. aircraft? Secondly, does the AIMSOG staff have the clearances and read-ons that they need to investigate all of these incidents? And thirdly, when your staff cannot be read on, are your questions to those who are read on even being answered?
So I'll start, and then I'll pass that to Mr. Bray. So we're very conscious of the potential blue-on-blue issue or U.S. on U.S., and so we've established relationships with organizations and entities that are potentially flying or developing platforms for their own interests, if you will. And our goal is to continue, and we have a repeatable process. I think we've had that process for some time, to deconflict activities that we may have to ensure that we are not potentially reporting on something that may be a developmental platform or a U.S. operational platform that is performing either testing or performing a mission. So we will have that in place. We've already had those discussions with organizations and entities. We want to ensure that we're protecting their equities. We want to ensure that we're protecting their sources and methods while also getting at what we have here. We want to be able to deconflict those.
Absolutely. The UAP Task Force has had a process in place to work with other elements of the Department of Defense and other elements of the government to ensure that that there is an as simple a way as possible to deconflict those. And when we reference that in the report, I should say that we were simply accounting for the fact that there could possibly be one or two data points that had leaked through, but we were quite confident that was not the explanation.
How are you all liaisoning with Space Command? Specifically, how are you partnering with the parts of the U.S. Space Command responsible for space domain awareness? And how, if at all, are you partnering with the Space Force to analyze UAPs?
The UAP Task Force has a very good relationship with Space Force, as it does with the rest of the Department of Defense. We have pulled analysts in from Space Force to ensure that that we're availing ourselves of that expertise, as well as any other material they may have that would be helpful.
And Congressman, as you know, Space Force and Space Command, they have responsibility for space domain awareness. So what we've done, we coordinated with Space Force, we coordinated with their J2, and she is on board in terms of helping us plug into what they have and for us to have this interactive exchange of information and data. And we're doing that with all the services, not just with Space Force or Space Command.
Thank you, sir. Ranking member, any additional questions? All right, Chairman Schiff. All right, with that, I want to thank you all for taking the time out. I also want to thank my colleagues on both sides of the aisle for participating in this very historical and important hearing. I think it's one of the few times we can demonstrate some degree of bipartisanship around UAPs and UFOs, so I love it, appreciate it, thank you. And we will see you all, we will recess this hearing for the moment and return in a closed session at noon.
Hello, everybody. John. Tom. Dan. How you doing? How's my boy Liam? Good. Okay. I don't have any announcements to make at the top. I do want to take just a moment to congratulate all the winners of the Pulitzer Prize yesterday. All the prizes yesterday. Lots of great reporting that was justly rewarded. I want to highlight two in particular. One, the award that went to the journalists of Ukraine, the Ukrainian reporters who are doing such a masterful job telling the story of their fellow citizens during this invasion and this war. It's tough to read, tough to watch, but you know what? It should be, based on what Mr. Putin's doing. And the bravery and skill that they're showing every day is truly inspiring, just as the work of and the fighting of the Ukrainian soldiers is. I also would be remiss if I didn't also congratulate the staff of the New York Times for the Pulitzer that they won in their coverage of civilian casualties caused by the United States military and military operations. That coverage was, and it still is, not comfortable, not easy, and not simple to address. We know that we had more work to do to better prevent civilian harm, and we're doing that work. We knew that we had made mistakes. We're trying to learn from those mistakes. And we knew that we weren't always as transparent about those mistakes as we should be. But their reporting reinforced those concerns, and in some cases gave us cause for additional concerns. And it made us ask ourselves some new and difficult questions of our own, even as it forced us to answer their difficult questions. I cannot say that this process was pleasant, but I guess that's the whole point. It's not supposed to be. That's what a free press at its very best does. It holds us to account, it makes us think, even as it informs. It changes our minds, and it helps us better at our big job of defending this nation. The talented staff and reporters in the New York Times, some of whom work in this very press corps alongside you, have done all that. And yes, we are grateful to them for it. We know they're happy for the Pulitzer, but we hope that they are also content in the knowledge that they made a real difference on a real and very challenging issue. And with that, we'll take questions. Lita.
Thanks. Can you address the uptick in violence in Odessa? You've talked a lot over the last week or month or more about ongoing shipment of weapons, et cetera, into Ukraine. But has this increased tempo in Odessa made any of those shipments more difficult? And there's been conflicting reports about whether or not there were hypersonic missiles fired into Odessa. Can you address that also? Thank you.
I have no evidence to speak to with respect to hypersonic missiles being fired at Odessa. We have seen the Russians use hypersonic missiles in the past over the last 75 plus days, largely to hit buildings, essentially. But it hasn't been a preponderance of the missiles by any stretch used by the Russians. And there's been no impact at least none that I'm tracking or that we're tracking, no impact to the flow of and shipment of material into Ukraine, either as a result of the strikes on Odessa or the strikes anywhere else. That stuff continues to flow every day. Dan.
President Zelensky told the congressional delegation that visited Kyiv recently that the government wanted multiple rocket launchers, more advanced drones, and anti-ship missiles. And the multiple rocket launchers would obviously have a longer range than the artillery that the U.S. and others have given them. Is that something that you're seriously considering?
I'm not going to get into our deliberations with the Ukrainians, Dan. I mean, we get a version of this question almost every day. We are in constant communication with the Ukrainians about the fight. In fact, the Secretary spoke to Minister Reznikov just yesterday about the fight. constant conversation at multiple levels with the Ukrainians. And as we continue to put together packages of drawdown authority going forward, it is very much informed by what the Ukrainians need in the fight. And what we can provide in the fight. I would just tell you that we are trying to focus and have since the very beginning on systems that they already know how to use and don't need any ramp-up time. Short of that, it's systems that are at least somewhat compatible and not totally alien to them, so that they can, again, the training is not onerous, it's not too lengthy, doesn't require too many people taken out of the fight, and that these are systems that we know that they can have an immediate impact. I'm not going to get ahead of decisions that haven't been made with respect to future drawdown authority or what systems might go. All I can tell you is that we're hearing directly from them. I mean, I understand that they also make similar arguments in public and also make similar arguments to lawmakers. It's not as if we're not talking to them about this in real time ourselves, and we do the best we can to fulfill those needs. And if we can't, then we're working hard with allies and partners who also have access to some systems that the Ukrainians desire and or are comfortable with to get them to help provide it as well. And we're even involved in helping coordinate the shipments of that other material that isn't American into Ukraine. Go ahead.
There's been an uptick, it appears, in Russian sorties. Is there any change in the airspace? Do the Russians have more control in the air? Are they closer to air superiority or no?
No, we would not assess that the Russians have air superiority over Ukraine, and we would still assess that the airspace is contested. And one of the reasons it's contested is because the Ukrainians still have a viable air force of their own, and they also have a very effective air defense capability, both short and long range air defense capability. And we know that it's having an impact on Russia because not only do they not have air superiority, but because of the kinds of flight profiles they're flying. Most of their sorties never even leave Russian airspace. So we're going to continue to stay focused on making sure that the Ukrainians have, again, that their air defense remains effective. Yes, Sylvie.
You have been speaking about the Ukrainian forces that were deployed along the Donbass front line. Is it your assessment that they are still holding this line, or did they move from this line?
Oh my goodness, Sylvie, there's movement every day in the Donbass, but the Ukrainians still have a force presence in the Donbass. I'm not going to detail where it is or how many. Again, that's force disposition data and information that I don't think we need to be publicly talking about. But they are still in the Donbass. They are still putting up a very stiff resistance, and they have prevented the Russians from achieving many of the objectives that they had in the Donbass region. They're still there, still fighting hard. Tara.
Pentagon's assessed that Russia is running through its stockpile of precision-guided munitions. Does this also include hypersonics? And does the Pentagon assess that Russia will be able to reconstitute this stockpile at all?
I don't have an update on their hypersonic inventory, Tara. They have not fired, from our assessment, a whole lot of hypersonic missiles. And again, it's a bit of a head scratcher why you would use a hypersonic against a building, but I'll let the Russians speak for that. And I've talked about this many times from the podium, we do assess that they are running through their precision-guided missiles at a pretty fast clip. We know that in Mariupol, for instance, their use of munitions has migrated from almost all precision-guided to a significant number of what we would call dumb bombs, non-precision guided munitions in Mariupol. And we believe that the sanctions are part of this because it's harder for Mr. Putin to get the kinds of components that make up precision-guided munitions, and his defense industrial base is having trouble keeping up with that. I'm sorry, there was another question there. How long it's going to take? I don't know. I can't predict how long it would take or what efforts Mr. Putin is making to replenish his supplies, I mean, that's a question only he and his Ministry of Defense can answer. But we know that already the sanctions are having an effect on his ability to wage war.
But if they're having to rely more on dumb bombs, wouldn't those aircraft have to enter Ukrainian airspace?
I didn't say they're never entering Ukrainian airspace, but they're not. But the preponderance of them are not. I mean, and when they do, they don't stay in Ukrainian airspace very long, and that's because Ukrainian air defenses are still so effective. Yeah.
Thank you, Jim. Because it's a great public interest in Ukraine, I have to return to my question I tried to discuss with you last week. It was too early, obviously. Right now, after President Biden signed the Lend-Lease for Ukraine Act, what's the situation from the Pentagon point of view? Do you have any plan how, the aid will be separated between the foreign military sales and possibly...
Yeah, we're still, I mean, I think, look, we're still analyzing the Lend-Lease Act to determine exactly, specifically, what authorities and what capabilities it will help us provide. I would, remind that in many cases, it's going to require some bilateral agreements between the United States and Ukraine. That's what Lend-Lease is about. And when through Lend-Lease, when an item is given to a country, they're responsible for, either returning it and maintaining it and returning it, and or providing compensation for it should it not be able to be returned. And so there's, for each item under Lend-Lease, you've got to work through that agreement. So we're still analyzing all the authorities now that the act, now the law will give us, and we're certainly going to act in accordance with the law, certainly within the spirit and the intent of it, but it's just too early to know with granularity exactly what that's going to mean. In the meantime, however, we continue to urge Congress to pass the President's supplemental request, which he asked for $33 billion. $5 billion of that would include drawdown authority, additional drawdown authority, so that we can continue uninterrupted providing things out of our own stocks. Yeah. Go ahead. Hey, Mike, how are you? It's hard with the lights sometimes to see everybody's face. What's going on?
Can I ask you a sort of general question? What do you think is the U.S. strategic objectives in arming Ukraine with billions of dollars of arms, apart from helping Ukraine to defend itself?
That is the strategic objectives, to help Ukraine defend itself against this unlawful and unprovoked invasion. I gather that the question is kind of getting at, what does victory look like? And victory needs to be defined by the Ukrainians, by President Zelensky. And the people of Ukraine, not the United States. So what we want to do is make sure that we are giving Ukraine the advantages they need on the battlefield and at any future negotiating table to be able to define for themselves what victory is going to look like.
So there isn't, as it were, an extra overarching objective?
An extra overarching objective, such as?
Such as vis-a-vis America and Russia.
I think, look, we obviously don't want to see, as you've heard Secretary Austin say, we don't want to see Russia in a position to be able to visit this sort of violence on their neighbors again. But this is not about the U.S. versus Russia, Mike. I mean, as much as Mr. Putin would love to make it about the West versus Russia, NATO versus Russia, U.S. versus Russia. This is about Russia against the people of Ukraine. And what we're focused on is making sure Ukraine can defend itself, that it is placed in positions of advantage on the battlefield and at the negotiating table. This is not about the U.S. versus Russia. It is very much about trying to help end this war and to give Ukraine the advantages that it needs to do that. Yeah, Tom.
Hi, John. Just an issue of Lend-Lease. It's very interesting. Should you have an open evening sometime to go back and see which nations actually have repaid the United States for the Lend-Lease Act of World War II?
Have you?
I have.
And the number is?
One.
One.
Yeah.
Who?
Great Britain.
Okay.
The Soviet Union, now Russia has not, just parenthetically. My question is not about Lend-Lease, however. Yesterday you
I don't have any open evenings either, so.
I know that. So I guess it was a rhetorical offering.
Yeah.
Yesterday you talked about why the conflict was not necessarily a stalemate. Today I'm going to ask you about another word, and that's the word proxy. You just said this is not about the U.S. versus Russia, and I did hear that.
Right.
But, you know, proxy war is that when one side supports someone in the conflict but is not directly engaged in the conflict, but acting on behalf of other parties. Would you call this a proxy war on the part of the United States and some NATO nations?
No.
And why not, please?
It's a war that Russia started, a war of choice, a war against the people of Ukraine. And it's a war that's being fought by the people of Ukraine. Now look, have they engendered, and rightly so, the support of the United States and so many other nations in this fight for freedom that they are fighting? Yes, they have. But that doesn't make it a proxy war. Again, that's the Putin trope. That's exactly the narrative that Mr. Putin would love to have out there, that it's the United States fighting Russia, that we're somehow, you know, trying to diminish Russia as a nation or force him out of power. None of that is true. And you can listen to those tropes throughout his speech yesterday. This isn't about Nazism. There's no Nazis in Ukraine. It's not about the West. It's not about the United States. It's about a completely fabricated justification that Mr. Putin put forth about his own national security being put at risk by Ukraine. That's what started this war. That's what this war is all about. And I think it's, you know, useful to remind that Ukraine threatened absolutely nobody, to include Russia. Anything else, Abraham?
Hey, John. Two questions. One, I wondered if you could preview the British Defense Secretary Wallace's visit tomorrow. Why is he coming? What does Secretary Austin expect to chat with him about? Is this like sort of getting closer to the next Ukraine contact group? And then secondly, on what you mentioned at the top about the Times story and the civilian casualties, I don't want to rehash old news, but can you talk about any ongoing changes that are being implemented now?
Yeah, we're in the middle of working through the. You saw the Secretary stood up a civilian harm mitigation team and process, and they've started now a 90-day initial process of getting themselves started and manning up, and that's ongoing. And their whole purpose is to look for innovative ways to help us get better at civilian harm mitigation and to be able to come back on a routine basis to the Secretary to advise him on better processes, better techniques, better policies to help mitigate civilian harm. So yeah, I mean, we've taken away not just from the reporting but from recent experiences that we know we have to get better at this, and we are. You know, and I think you're going to see, even before their 90-day initial assessment period is up, I think you're going to see the Secretary speak about this as well. I mean, it's something we take seriously, and it's something that we're not afraid to admit that we take seriously and that we want to do better. Unlike Russia, unlike the unmitigated violence and destruction that they're causing on the people of Ukraine, without care, without acknowledgement, no investigations, no transparency, no effort to even not cause civilian harm, much less the war crimes that their soldiers are committing on the ground. Now look, I'm not saying that we have everything in order. We don't, and we know that. And here's the difference. We're willing to admit it. And we're willing to investigate, and we're willing to stand up teams to go look and get better at it. And I'm willing to stand up here at the podium and talk about it, and so is the Secretary. And we're willing to acknowledge that sometimes your reporting, the reporting that all of you have done, not just the New York Times, but all of you have done on civilian harm, we also take seriously. And when you ask us tough questions, we answer them. You're not seeing any of that from the Russian Ministry of Defense. None. Zero. And you know what? You're not going to see it going forward. And I'm all lathered up. And what was your first question?
I want to drill down a little bit on that. Does the Secretary anticipate there would be work with the U.S. Air Force, since airmen were involved and they're involved in some
Oh
of
yeah,
these
look, I
strikes?
mean, it cuts across services, Abraham. I mean, and it's not about looking at a service specific, but oftentimes in the last 20 plus years of warfare, when we have caused civilian harm, it's because of joint operations. So sometimes it's the result of people on the ground, sometimes it's the result of people in air ops. I mean, and sometimes it's kind of both. I mean, you can find examples where coordination and communication wasn't as good as it should have been, and intelligence analysis wasn't where it should have been. So, I mean, it cuts across. It wouldn't be fair to say, well, it's, we're going to go after the Air Force on this. I mean, we're going to go after ourselves, all of ourselves on this, and try to get better at it.
So the first was on Wallace and the Ukraine contact.
Oh, yeah. Well, we look forward to having Mr. Wallace back at the Pentagon. I think this will be his second meeting in the Pentagon with Secretary Austin. Of course, he's no stranger to the Pentagon. He was here in the previous administration as well. Great Britain is, as always, a terrific partner and such a staunch ally. So it's a real treat for us to be able to have Mr. Wallace back here in the Pentagon. The Secretary is very much looking forward to the conversation. Look, I think it goes without saying that Ukraine will be a major topic of discussion. And the British have been leaders and strong contributors in terms of providing security assistance to Ukraine and in helping coordinate that assistance as well. So I think there's a lot to talk about in terms of support to Ukraine. Minister Wallace was at the Ramstein contact group, now we're calling it the contact group, the consultative meeting back in Germany. There will be another one this month, most likely a virtual meeting. The May meeting, the Secretary wants to do these monthly, so the one in May will most likely be virtual. We don't have it all locked in right now. It'll be later this month. And I have no doubt that the Secretary and Minister Wallace will have a chance to talk about sort of what the agenda on that first contact group, second consultative meeting looks like and feels like. But there's going to be a lot to discuss, and we're absolutely delighted to have him back.
Thanks, John.
Yeah, Rio.
Thank you. I want to ask you about Taiwan. The U.S. warship, the USS Port Royal, transited the Taiwan Strait today. That this is the second transit over the last 2 weeks. Are there any particular concern about the Chinese military activities around the Taiwan Strait? What does the U.S. want to demonstrate by stepping up the maritime activities now?
I don't know that I call it stepping up, Rio. We've conducted Taiwan Strait transits before. It's not atypical for us. And you're right. This was another routine transit conducted today on the 10th through international waters in accordance with international law. The ship transited through a corridor in the strait that is beyond the territorial sea of any coastal state, which is the way we do this. And the Port Royal's transit demonstrates, you asked what it demonstrates our commitment to a free and open Indo-Pacific. I want to stress again, we will continue to fly, sail, and operate anywhere where international law applies, and that's what this was about. This was the application of international law and our right to operate inside that law. I mean, we believe in a rules-based international order. International law is part of that rules-based international order. Okay, let me go to the phones here. Idris.
Hey, John. Earlier today during the hearing, the head of the DIA described the war as a stalemate. Yesterday when you talked, you wouldn't go that far, and I was just wondering if you now agree with him. Is there a different definition maybe of stalemate? I'm just trying to, sort of square the circle between the two comments.
We were talking yesterday about what's going on in the Donbass, which is the focus of the war right now. We still believe it's a very dynamic environment. It's a very kinetic fight, and villages and towns continue to change hands, and the Russians have not made much of any appreciable progress. But that's not to say they've made no progress over the last few days and week or so. So I'm comfortable with the way I couched it yesterday. Let's see, Howard Altman.
Thanks, John. Let's change the pace a little bit. Next week, Congress is going to be holding the first hearing into UFOs in 50 years. There's going to be two people from the Pentagon testifying. Can you comment about that? And also, can you tell us any update on the Airborne Objects Identification and Management Synchronization Group, otherwise known as AOMSIG? Any update on what they're doing?
I don't have an update for you on the UAP group that you're talking about. We're still working to sufficiently staff that organization and get them into a battle rhythm, but I don't have any updates for you. And I could not hear your first question.
Can you comment about next week? Congress is going to hold the first hearing in 50 years on UFOs, UAPs. I was wondering if you just comment on that, since two people from U.S. military are going to be testifying there.
No, we're looking forward to the upcoming opportunity here to engage members of Congress on this very important matter. I'm not going to get ahead of that testimony, but we are absolutely committed to being as transparent as we can with the American people and with members of Congress about our perspectives on this and what we're going to try to do to make sure we have a better process for identifying these phenomena, analyzing that information in a more proactive, coordinated way than it's been done in the past, and that we also are doing what we need to do to mitigate any safety issues as many of these phenomena have been cited in training ranges and in training environments. And so we're very much concerned about safety of flight. So we're looking forward to the opportunity to talk to Congress about this. I won't get ahead of the hearing, though. Let's see, Mike Brest.
Sounded like Howard had a follow-up. If he wants to ask, he can go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. Just quickly, how concerned is the Pentagon that these might be some kind of adversary, objects from somebody like China or Russia, et cetera?
I don't have. We don't have a view on that, Howard. I mean, there's been enough of the sightings in terms of, particularly in terms of training ranges, that we do have, we think, legitimate safety of flight concerns here. But the department hasn't come to a conclusion about what all these phenomena are, what they represent. That's why we're putting this group together, so that we can do a better job of just collating the information. It's been sort of ad hoc in the past in terms of a pilot here or a pilot there seeing something, and the reporting procedures haven't been consistent. So what we're trying to do with this group is get together a process here, and I know process isn't very fun for you to report on, and probably not very fun for me to talk about, but that's what we need. We need a better process. That's what this group is going to do for us. Let's see, Jared, I'm sorry, Mike, go ahead.
Thank you. To follow up on Abraham's question, OSD said back at the end of February that General Michael Garrett's investigation into the 2019 strike in Syria was in its final stages, and we haven't heard anything about it since, so I thought I'd ask.
I think that work is complete, and the Secretary's working his way through General Garrett's report, and I think you'll probably hear more about that soon. Jared.
Hi, John. Thank you. Just wanted to check if you can confirm the King of Jordan is in town for visits at the White House and among lawmakers. Just checking if he's going to be visiting the Pentagon this week and meeting with senior officials. Thanks.
I don't have anything on the schedule to announce right now, but when we do, we will. Okay, got time for a couple more in the back.
Yes, there's a report that Belarus has sent the special forces down to the border, and it said that it was due to 20,000 Ukrainians that are currently on the border of Belarus. Can you collaborate that information at all?
I cannot, no.
And also, is there any update on the number of Ukrainian soldiers that are still at the plant in Mariupol?
I don't have an update for you. I don't think the numbers appreciably changed, but I would let the Ukrainians speak to their force levels in any one location. We do assess that they are still there, they are still resisting, and the proof of that, that the Russians know they haven't taken Mariupol, is that they're continuing to bomb Mariupol, and they still have force levels outside Mariupol themselves and in the city. Did you have one?
I wanted to give you an opportunity to respond to this Russian media report that's saying that the U.S. and NATO have military equipment lined up on Finland's border with Russia. Is that just a bogus Russian claim, or is there any truth behind that?
Bogus. Okay, thanks everybody.
that the world is facing. They are collectively experiencing these traumas, including COVID-19, the climate crisis, conflicts and systems of inequality and exclusion, including gender inequity and systemic racism. Nevertheless, following a global consultation carried out by the United Nations to mark the 75th anniversary of the UN, turns out that young people were the most hopeful generation about the future of multilateralism and the United Nations. So they are hopeful that a better world is possible for all of us as long as we take urgent, concrete, and collective action. So we will be listening not only to Vlad and Yandi, who are joining us virtually, but also listening to the stories of young leaders from around the world, from Lemnik, Fatima, Samuel, Valentina, and Yolani. Let's take a look.
Hi everyone, my name is Valentina from Italy. I am a farmer and I am also one of the leaders of Coldiretti Donne Impresa, the largest female farmers association.
My name is Yolani Johnson from the Republic of the Marshall Islands, and I'm the Deputy Director for the Teenage Pregnancy Prevention for the Youth to Youth and Health.
My name is Lemnek Tiller and I'm a co-founder and leader of Wayuda, which is a social entrepreneurship that aims to improve the quality of life of vulnerable communities here in my country, Colombia.
I'm a team member at the Street to School initiative. Street to School is a blended offline and online community learning initiative where we teach people how to read and write. That's basic literacy and numeracy and some soft skills.
Hello everyone, my name is Samuel Kellerhaus from Switzerland, and I'm the co-founder at LP Solar, a social enterprise that empowers refugees with access to sustainable energy and essential services.
You can feel the energy from the youth leaders across the globe, and we're being joined now by two of them. Yande from Zambia, can you share with us briefly some of the work that you've been doing in the areas of education and gender equality and inclusion? Welcome.
Yes, thank you so much, Juju. My name is Yande, and I'm a 17-year-old education, girls, and women's rights activist from Zambia and the co-chair of Transform Education, a youth-led coalition hosted by the United Nations Girls Education Initiative, where we're transforming education for gender equality. We basically leverage on a cross-sectoral and multi-stakeholder approach to acting on the intersections of education while demanding for a power shift. It's an honor to be here. Thank you.
Well, that's very impressive, Yande. Thank you for joining us. And Vlad, give us a sense of the work that you've been doing, especially with regard to climate action and green jobs for youth.
Thank you very much, Juju. It's an honor to be here. Indeed, my main work in my current mandate as the member of the UN Secretary General's Youth Advisory Group on Climate Change has been particularly focused on green jobs. And that is for a very simple reason, that in the post-pandemic recovery, we need not only to recover our health or our hope through green action, but we as youth also need to recover the dignity of work. And that we can do only through a robust green jobs agenda. Apart from that, I am also extremely focused on ensuring that through the work of the Youth Advisory Group, we, via example, show that youth matter at the table as experts first and foremost.
So much of today's discussion has been an intergenerational conversation. So I'd like to hear from both of you about this following question, about what you see as the role that young people can play in responding to the world's most pressing challenges. Yande, let's start with you.
Of course, thanks so much, Juju. I believe that youth and adolescents have mobilized and organized in resilient ways to counter the effects the pandemic has had on education, health, the economy, and on the sustainable development goals as a whole. As we have seen from these videos, we have not let the pandemic stop us from utilizing our core skills to continue changing this world. Youth and adolescents have intensified massively community mobilization to address the issues they face in their communities, from the climate crisis to issues of gender equality. The role of adolescents and youth is clear. We're mobilizers, catalyzers of change, and we're essential partners to social progress.
Absolutely. And Vlad, your thoughts on this?
First of all, before I start on this, allow me to correct you, Juju, a little bit from one of your points at the very start. Youth is not the future. We are the very much current and present generation in the process of deal-making and policy-making. And we have seen at all levels how youth can be involved in so many roles with so much sacrifice and hard work, both during the pandemic and before that. But I would also caution against celebrating it too much, because the more we see the displays of such hard work, the more it should also strike us that these efforts are in fact supplementing the leadership that is lacking at the level of public policy, at the highest political level, where the decisions are actually taken and where we are still absent. That perspective is also important to bear in mind.
I stand corrected. You're very true, Vlad. Children and youth are very much the present and the future. I want to take a time now to look at our second video clip that looks at youth leaders as they take their own steps to reach SDGs.
Here we are in one of our offline learning hub, where the place is provided to us by the Bulamas. This is their safe space. We teach them with their local language and how they will stay in school. And the income from the sales of those local handcraft mates goes to them to make them stay at school and to scale some other solutions in other communities.
I'm a descendant of the Wayuu indigenous community, one of the largest of America and one of the most unprotected ethnic group of the whole world. Despite of the political corruption, the lack of access to drinking water, primary medical care, and even deaths in children due to malnutrition, we have worked tirelessly to support their livelihood and ethnicity. Since 2016, we have implemented 3 prototypes of automated solar pumping systems and a series of land productivity and livestock farming projects. Also to support their culture and the ways of life, Wayuda has worked closely with them in the technification of their manufacturing and the construction of a pilot ethno-educational institution that benefits more than 600 children in the middle of the desert of La Guajira.
It is not always easy for the young people to bear in mind the SDGs and work towards reaching them. The biggest challenge is to have access to the land due to limited resources. Also, unfortunately, innovative and eco-friendly resources are still the most expensive ones. The initial investment is sometimes unaffordable. Last but not least, it is everyone's responsibility to raise consciousness on climate changes and social crisis. I believe youth lead can drive the change and be examples of virtuous and sustainable businesses. And this is why they should be guaranteed access to more resources, educational programs and assistance, together with the modernization of bureaucracy. I believe that the work we are doing every day in our farms and in the schools is the right way to save the resources that we have without compromising the future generation's survival.
Youth to Youth and Health organization as a whole does a lot of school and community outreaches on sustainable development toward quality education and gender equality. We provide activity for young people that build knowledge, skill, and self-esteem. The organization is unique in that it is staffed and run almost entirely by Marshallese youth. Unique to this program was a focus on youth education and participation, not only in terms of targeting youth to teach them core lessons of family planning, but also utilizing youth in spreading messages to the community and local school through peer education.
Today, over 900 million people still lack access to electricity, with the world's refugee population often at the center of this. Imagine leaving behind everything you've ever known and being left with only one way to contact your family and friends. Transfer money and access the internet. Suddenly, what just seemed like a phone has become a lifeline. We have developed a range of solar-powered solutions providing access to mobile phone charging, water filtration, and offline educational content. In addition, we have been piloting a micro-entrepreneur model that empowers camp residents to run their own solar charging business, thereby generating income and supporting SDG number 8. Our projects are also always based on international and national partnerships between private, NGO and public sector actors supporting Goal 17 of the SDGs. Thus far, we have validated our approach in Greece and Rwanda, having deployed 11 units across 6 refugee camps, impacting 30,000 refugees per month, thus already acquiring a first proof of concept.
As we heard earlier, as we heard this morning from global leaders, one size does not fit all in tackling these global problems. So there we have 5 youth leaders from around the world working on solutions on the ground, engaging with local communities and implementing SDGs. So Vlad and Yande, I have another question for you guys, which is, we know that one of the barriers for young people is the lack of investment, the lack of resources. What immediate actions do you think can be taken to respond to that challenge? Let's start with you, Vlad.
Thank you for this question. I would divide my response into 2 categories. The first one, that it comes to financial resources, we need to think about the obstacles there primarily through the lens of scale and risk, because that's how even the governments and also financial institutions think. Most of the youth projects, be it the non-profit ones or entrepreneurial ones, they involve very high degree of risk and not so much scale. What is needed here is a concerted multinational effort to pool resources together to fund as many such projects as possible, while ensuring that those investments are de-risked, so that both youth have access to the necessary resources, while at the same time those who are funding. When it comes to non-financial, like in-kind resources, we should tell them there is a need for effort on the national level to make sure that in all post-COVID recovery packages, those types of services that are required for youth not just to survive but to thrive, they represent a significant part of the infrastructure packages, because infrastructure is not just about roads, bridges, or buildings, it's about primarily people, and first of all, youth in the context of this crisis.
That's a brilliant answer, Vlad. And Yonde, I want you to take a crack at it, this idea that it's often scarcity that drives these decisions. What can we do to drive youth initiatives and make it more of a spending priority?
Yes, I'll start by saying that I completely agree with what Vlad says. I believe that we need to see an opening of spaces. This is very critical. We must foster a holistic intergenerational response to working for the Sustainable Development Goals and to building back better post-pandemic. Our participation must be meaningful in that. Youth are not a social media post. Our participation goes far beyond posting a young person and putting in the caption, "Youth are the future." We're the present and we're key stakeholders, change makers, and leaders of today. We need to be in the climate sector at the table, co-leading climate negotiations. We need to be in the education sector, on the table, co-leading education curriculum development. We need to be in the health sector, advocating for adequate access to SRHR, developing comprehensive sexuality education curriculums, and spearheading the destigmatization of mental health. This, above all things, is key. We need to be in our rightful place, and that is where decisions are being made. As young people, we're demanding for member states and key civil society to fund youth for our work as well, urgently. We say that we're all about youth leadership, then we say co-create, partner, and fund us. We're demanding to see an acceleration of funding towards youth and girl-led organizations who are intensifying community mobilization on the ground, leading education movements, leading feminist movements, and gender justice movements. Funding our work is key. But lastly, we must recognize that allocations towards funding the SDGs is important. That's totalities ending in 0.5% are not working. If we want to achieve the SDGs, if we want to put education in its rightful place of being a fundamental human right and not a privilege, if we want to end child marriage and give every single child the opportunity to grow up in a safe and inclusive world, then we must fund. Let me end by saying, Juju, above all, we must invest in an intergenerational action response just beyond intergenerational dialogue. We must invest in action.
I must say the urgency in your demands are quite inspiring, Yonde. But Vlad, let me turn back to you. How do you sort of break down the barriers to the access to the levers of power, to the decision-making processes that Yonde is talking about? How do you think we can better connect the work that's being done by young people at the local level to the global decision-makers that Yonde is referring to?
I think in this question, the party which we put the burden onto is not quite right, because I believe, and I can tell from my experience on multiple levels, all the way to my current stint at the UN Secretary General's Youth Advisory Group on Climate Change, that the youth, they are doing everything they can to break those barriers, and they are sincere in their effort to reach out to those in power for a dialogue and a constructive engagement together. But this cannot happen just by our own effort and volition alone. It takes two to tango, as it says. And unfortunately, there won't be more than a piecemeal progress on that until those who are now in power realize that often their behaviors and their ignorance represent that barrier that we are breaking. It is important that we bring a change of attitude, not just from below, but from above too. And that will be a meeting point, and we are waiting for them at that meeting point.
And so, Yonde, how do you break that barrier? How do you break the, maybe not ignorance, but the deafness of global leaders who need to cut you in and allow you to tango?
We must advocate, simply, we must advocate that adolescents and youth are put in key decision-making positions of power. I argue unless we're systemically integrated into leadership, then our engagement further remains tokenistic. We urge governments to remove ageist restrictions to accessing positions of power, as well as eradicating hostile environments that prevent youth from engaging in the political sphere of their country, as well as ending systems that perpetuate patriarchy and beliefs that youth, girls, and women are the underdogs of the political system and cannot occupy occupy high positions of power. There is a notion that there is no space for girls in power and in government, but I beg to differ. But lastly, I must highlight, and most importantly, we must redesign and restructure local and global education systems to address the key sustainability issues of the world, from issues of gender equality to the climate crisis, and most importantly, leadership. I firmly believe that our education systems are too based on the regurgitation of facts to pass exams and not enough on how youth and adolescents can transform economic, social, and political systems for gender equality. We must rally to ensure that our education, especially girls' education, challenges and changes the status quo for good. Juju, the missing link has been clear for a long time. We need to fill it.
Yande, I appreciate your thoughts. I want to give us a few vivid examples of the power of youth-led leadership. Let's take a look.
It is necessary to create public policies that protect entrepreneurs and their work, mainly where it is supported, empowered, and prioritized.
And as young people, we now have a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to be solutions-oriented and act as agents of change and pass a brighter torch on to future generations. We thus have a responsibility to make all young people aware of all of the different issues facing us today and encourage them to act on those issues.
I believe that the work we are doing every day in our farms and in the school is the right way to save resources and not compromising the future of our generations. Our ideas, values, and culture can really be the missing piece in reaching the SDGs.
I believe youth lead by empowering communities with cutting-edge technologies mixing with ancestral knowledges. And that is why young people must propitiate self-sustainable environments that impact joint growth.
We must break down the barriers of financial access, lack of mentorship, and training so that youth-led organizations can thrive. I believe youth lead by innovating for a more sustainable and inclusive future, and that is why young people must be engaged as equal partners as we embark on delivering the SDGs.
I believe youth leadership has the power to build resilience and educate their faith. And that is why young people must be connected to the internet, mobilized and empowered with skills and policies to be equal partners in delivering the decade of action.
You know, in our final round of questions, I want to ask you, we often talk about the enabling environment to allow youth leaders to make meaningful participation in these decision-making bodies. What do you think that enabling environment looks like? And what's the one thing you would tell global leaders as a final message at UNGA 76? Yande, let me begin with you.
Sure, thanks so much, Juju. I think for me, I'll begin with my message, which is simple. To world leaders, you say you will build back better from COVID-19. We say, show us. You say we'll create a greener, more prosperous future. And we say, show us. Show us gender transformative education systems. Show us an education that is accessible to everyone. And show us an education that centers gender equality and climate. Youth and adolescents are ready to partner with you to achieve the SDGs and achieve a better world for all. In terms of our education, millions of girls are expected to drop out of school post-COVID, a number we simply cannot afford. The climate crisis is worsening and the war on children and girls is throttling deeper and deeper. We call on you to stop the pushback and invest in our future. Lastly, to my president who is at this assembly, Your Excellency, Mr. Hakainde Hichilema, I'm calling on you to appoint a special advisor for girls and children's rights issues, an adolescent girl who can advise you on how we can achieve gender equality and achieve it truly. And finally, to the leaders who are listening, young people are waiting for your call. Indeed, we always have been. And the question remains, will you answer us?
Excellent statement, Yande. Thank you. Vlad, take it away.
To me, the enabling environment is primarily about three terms: trust, resources, and accountability. Trust in bringing us together to the table on the equal terms and co-developing the solutions. Resources to making sure that as many people as possible can do that regardless of their origin. And accountability in terms of assuring that we can actually hold them accountable on the implementation. And when it comes to the messengers, I want to say first and foremost that the continuous failure as visionaries of many of them puts us in a position where we still need to take more on ourselves without having the adequate resources to do that. That can lead not only to suboptimal outcomes for our climate and our planet, but also to our own mental health. So I would like for them to take a moment to reflect before they come to those stands on the Anga Hall again with their speeches, to reflect on that and see that beyond those speeches and beyond those actions or inactions often, there are very direct consequences for us that will last for decades.
Vlad, Yande, I must say, listening to both of you and your fellow youth leaders, I'm feeling very reassured by the future and by your leadership. And if your words speak for accountability, it goes a long way. Thank you so much, both of you, for joining in this conversation and also for your leadership that's clearly demonstrable. Thank you.
Thank you, Juju.
Thank you.
And now we're going to return to hear from more world leaders today, this time from the Latin American and Caribbean region. We're going to begin with an overview of the potential for SDG progress in the region between now and 2030. We will hear from the distinguished presidents of the plurinational state of Bolivia, the Republic of Colombia, the Republic of Costa Rica, the Republic of Cuba, and the Republic of Guatemala.
Del Secretario General de la...
We join the call of the Secretary General of the UN, Antonio Guterres, because we believe that the 2030 Agenda is of great importance to generate favorable conditions for our peoples to access mechanisms of sustainable development. And because we believe in a multipolar world, diverse but united in a single effort to lead our world to a new stage in which no one is left behind, and in which fundamental rights and conditions for development are guaranteed and oriented to promote the equality of our human collectivity without any border, wall, or distinction. To this end, we commit all our efforts to promote, support, and defend the consolidation of our democracies, our economies, and our systems of life, and to have a unanimous voice to safeguard social justice that is essential to keep our course fixed and aimed at the goals set out in the 2030 Agenda. By reflecting on a world that has suffered the ravages of the pandemic, our actions will be focused mainly on the following actions that will allow us to build our future. Economic diversification with industrialization and import substitution, modernization of the productive apparatus, employment generation, equitable distribution of income, deepening of the exercise of fundamental rights of the Bolivian people, and the protection of Mother Earth. We will focus our efforts on these duties without forgetting about equality and access to opportunities, free from all types of discrimination, to health, to education, to the eradication of extreme poverty, to food sovereignty, and to integral development in harmony with nature. And this as an alternative to the fight against for the fight against the climate crisis and a better distribution of resources among all peoples. Thank you. The 17 SDGs and the 2030 Agenda are a major global achievement. Not only was Colombia played a leading role in them, but we also are at the helm. In the pandemic, Colombia upheld the premise of leaving no one behind and to building a better world. We did so because it is key to the 2030 Agenda, which is the tool available to the world today to tackle the health risks, the environmental crisis, poverty, and inequalities. And thanks to a whole of Colombia effort, we achieved tangible results, which we shared last July when we presented our third VNR to the United Nations High-Level Political Forum. As at December 2020, our overall progress is 72.1% based on the targets we set as a government, and we made more than 85% progress on 5 goals, including industry, innovation, and infrastructure, and on sustainable cities and communities, and on responsible production and consumption. However, this had an overall adverse impact on performance of 56% of our tracking indicators, affecting the targets on ending poverty, zero hunger, and reducing inequalities. In Colombia, we prevented these impacts from worsening by rolling out more resources under programs such as Families in Action, Youth in Action, and Greater Colombia. We also set up a VAT refund structure and the Solidarity Income Program, through which more than 3 million vulnerable families that were not receiving state aid have been able to cope with the effects of the pandemic. Through our new law, we have benefited more than 29 million Colombians. We have a vaccination plan through which 41 million doses have been will be delivered by the end of September. Our economy also is showing signs of recovery, with 17.6% growth in the second quarter of this year, which leads us to project growth of over 7% by the end of 2021. This progress is being achieved in tandem with our policy of sustainability, producing while conserving and conserving while producing. We have been upgrading our nationally determined contribution by targeting a 51% reduction in greenhouse gases by 2030. In this decade of action and results, we as member states must ensure that we achieve our major goals of eradicating poverty, combating inequality and injustice, and tackling climate change. The SDGs of the 2030 Agenda are a blueprint for recovering with resilience, and more importantly for Colombia has been doing, transitioning all of us together towards a more equitable society. Thank you very much. Mr. Secretary General, Mr. President. 6 years ago, when we assembled at the United Nations, practically all the leaders of the world committed to leaving no one behind in the common purpose of fulfilling by 2030 the so-called Sustainable Development Goals. Truth be told, however, millions of human beings continue to be left behind. For many nations, most of them, the objectives seem unattainable in less than a decade. An unjust and anti-democratic international order is the cause of the inequalities and exclusion which we are now facing, as most countries in a scenario made worse by the devastating effects of the COVID-19 pandemic. As long as this world order prevails, the most noble targets will continue to be a mere mirage. I say so and speak from a place of experience from Cuba. We undertook the commitments seriously and responsibly, but we are also aware of the major challenges facing us as a small island developing state and the vicious impact of the economic, commercial, and financial blockade imposed by the United States. As we have stated in protest so many times in the General Assembly, this policy of blockade, revived deliberately and opportunistically in the context of the pandemic, is the main obstacle to the efforts of Cuba to press ahead with its economic and social development and in implementing the 2030 agenda. We have huge difficulties ahead of us, but it is also our will to build a sovereign, independent, socialist, democratic, prosperous, and sustainable nation. And for this reason, we reiterate here today our commitment to the 2030 agenda as evinced by the tangible coherence between the goals and targets of our national economic and social development plan for 2030 and the SDGs. On the 13th of July, Cuba presented its VNR on implementation of the 2030 agenda to the United Nations High-Level Political Forum, and our VNR showed that our priorities are focused on providing comprehensive and full development for human beings, achieving economic development with equity and greater living conditions, better living conditions for people. We will continue to press ahead beyond 2030 on the path towards sustainable development by strengthening planning and coordination at the various levels of government, by promoting innovation, scientific research, and building partnerships among the various actors of our society. And these are all vital tools to recovery and progress. Cuba will also continue to share its experience with other nations through South-South cooperation and by focusing on renewed and stronger multilateralism, on cooperation with solidarity, and on seeking global solutions to common problems. We as revolutionaries are inveterate optimists, and in the worst of scenarios, we seek and we do find solutions because we believe in people and we believe in the future. Building the world that we dream of is an uncommon but possible task. If we renounce selfishness and we work together to transform the current unjust international order into one that is more just, democratic, and equitable, where ultimately no one will be left behind. Thank you very much. Your Excellency, President of the General Assembly, Abdullah Shahid, Your Excellency, Secretary General Antonio Guterres, heads of states, delegates, and representatives of government, Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. Mr. President, we are deeply, we congratulate you on your election to the 76th session of the United Nations General Assembly under presidency of hope, work for people, the planet, and prosperity. Mr. President, at present, the world is faced with the so-called, with what we refer to as the decade of action to fulfill the 2030 agenda, which we must now reflect on to see what we have achieved and what remains ahead of us. We must transform our world, and the 2030 agenda for the sustainable development is the way to do so, and with the participation of the various sectors of society committed to achieving the Guatemala that we want. We carried out coordination between the international agenda with our national agenda to identify the 10 national development priorities within the framework of the SDGs. And in July, we presented to the high-level political forum our third VNR as a result of our review in Guatemala, in which we had the participation of all sectors: academia, local governments, public sector, civil society, the private sector, and the cooperation community. And we reported on our SDGs on health, nutrition, natural resources, institutional strengthening, jobs and investment, and reducing poverty and social protection. And all of this is available on the platform, which you will then see. So therefore, I would like to point out that the SDGs have been carried out in a completely different context from what we expected between the pandemic and the effects of climate change. Therefore, we must look at how we can preserve health and the well-being of our population. And I must mention here that for mitigating these efforts, we need, therefore, to come up with new models for development financing, where in addition to the economic aspects, we look at other factors such as vulnerability and the social context. This will help middle-income countries such as Guatemala to continue with their national development plans and to ensure that we make the vaccine available as part of our response to the pandemic. And here I wanted to point out that we have come up against challenges in acquiring or purchasing the vaccine, and we had to compete with developed countries. And the COVAX facility has been an ally in our vaccination strategy, and we have to take urgent measures to ensure equitable access, because so far this has not been the case. And as mix, we have been finding it difficult to purchase vaccines. Furthermore, in the context of climate change, Guatemala continues to be among those countries that are most severely affected by climate change and are most vulnerable, and we have an impact on our public and private infrastructure, our agriculture, our biological diversity, our national economy, and on the living conditions of our affected populations. In the future, we are expecting to see important impacts on the quality and amount of water available for our human use, commercial use, industrial and agricultural use, and this may be a risk to our food security. And for this reason, we have placed priority on health, water, and sanitation to overcome these challenges. Therefore, we formed the Climate Change Council, bringing together various sectors of society, and we are looking to see how we can best tackle the cost of loss and damages, estimated at more than $6,270.9 million. And we also recommended prioritizing the SDGs related to climate change, as well as coming up with external financing. And we were declared as a high-risk country to this effect. Therefore, given it before the General Assembly, we are now making this request. In closing, the SDGs are SDG 17 is important to partnerships for achieving our goal of leaving no one behind. Everyone must rise up. No one should be left behind. Not one, not two, but all of us together. May God bless all our people, but more especially, may God bless Guatemala.
I accept my government's congratulations on the renewal of your term of office, and be assured of Guyana's continued cooperation and support in the execution of your duties. Guyana welcomes the convening of the SDG moment in order to explore best practices, lessons, and opportunities for resilient post-COVID recovery, and ensuring the global community's commitment to the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. My country's commitment to leaving no one behind is unalterable. Guyana is a plural society with 6 ethnic groups and a kaleidoscope of cultures. This diversity impels us to approach policymaking in an even-handed and inclusive manner. Agenda 2030 represents a framework for sustainable, inclusive, and equitable development. It is therefore imperative that the international community is not distracted or detoured from achieving the agenda objectives and targets. Unfortunately, even prior to the pandemic, progress on the implementation of the 2030 Agenda was slothful and lagging. The pandemic has only compounded this reality. It has reversed many development gains and has threatened the attainment of the SDGs. The uneven global response to the pandemic has not helped. In order to attenuate this uneven response, avert the adverse consequences of a two-tier recovery, and prepare for future exogenous shocks, greater attention must be paid to strengthening resilience, particularly for the most vulnerable countries, like small island developing states and low-lying coastal states. This will require debt rescheduling, increased access to soft resources, and increased financing for climate adaptation. In advance of critical summits and intergovernmental meetings, which are significant in the thrust towards accelerated implementation of the 2030 Agenda, I am pleased to take this opportunity to expound on some of the initiatives that the government of Guyana has been engaged in to further the achievement of the SDGs. First, recognizing that food systems are critical not only to the elimination of hunger and the reduction of poverty, but is also linked to the achievement of several of the SDGs. Guyana is spearheading the CARICOM Agri-Food System Agenda, which prioritizes regional food security and nutrition. Second, as a low-lying coastal developing state, Guyana's economic development is being guided by a low-carbon development strategy, which simultaneously facilitates sustainable economic development while combating climate change. Third, conscious that the pandemic has engendered learning loss, the government of Guyana is providing tangible support for learning from nursery to tertiary levels. This support includes the provision of 20,000 online scholarships to universities around the world for vocational undergraduate and postgraduate studies, intensifying digital learning and preparing to make university education free by 2025. Guyana remains committed to presenting its second voluntary national review in a decade of action to realize the Sustainable Development Goals by 2030. Guyana will stay wedded to SDGs and will strive through its small but aggressive advocacy to ensure that this, the third decade of the 21st century, is characterized by transformation in which Agenda 2030 remains the primary guiding framework. I thank you.
Buenos días.
Good day. I greet you on behalf of the people of Panama. I am pleased to have the opportunity to exchange experiences and contributions related to the Sustainable Development Goals as an unbreakable commitment of our country. Our government has always had the objective of governing to transform, and our government's strategic plan is aligned with the Sustainable Development Goals. Last year, even in the midst of the pandemic, we presented to you the voluntary national review with the results of the efforts the Panamanian government had achieved on each of the global goals related to the SDGs. That same focus has oriented our plans and actions from before and during the pandemic, and it will also guide us in overcoming this crisis during the post-pandemic phase. We will continue to promote opportunity and inclusion as indispensable factors for fighting poverty and inequality, to strengthen democracy and increase spaces for citizen participation on the road to development in order to build a sustainable and inclusive future. As a sample of this commitment, our government called the country to a national dialogue with the support of the United Nations with the purpose of identifying issues that matter most to our people and to receive their proposed solutions for a consensus-based decision-making process which will last beyond any one government's term. Citizens responded to this call to dialogue, which we named Bicentennial Pact Closing Gaps, with enthusiasm, participating and with the participation and contribution of over 175,000 proposals. That joint vision will contribute to maintaining focus on sustainable development, ensuring long-term solutions with social justice, equal opportunities, and respect to human rights. Ladies and gentlemen, the multiple effects of the pandemic teach us unquestionably that we must undertake the necessary structural transformations for sustainable development together in this, the house of all of us, planet Earth. Panama reaffirmed its readiness to participate and contribute to collaboration efforts that will allow the advancement of joint development policies to minimize delays in the fulfillment of the 2030 agenda, especially now when we must accelerate recovery in the post-pandemic stage. Thank you very much.
Distinguished heads of state for their contributions to today's conversations. Joining me now to reflect on the contributions we've just heard are Mr. Elliot Harris, UN Chief Economist and Assistant Secretary General in the Department of Economic and Social Affairs, and Ms. Solange Maria Pinto Ribeira, Deputy Chief Executive Officer of Neo Engineeria and Vice Chair of the Board of UN Global Compact. Thank you both for joining us.
Thank you for having us.
Well, we have two concrete questions that I want to have you address. First, Mr. Harris, if I may begin with you. What did you hear from leaders from Latin America and the Caribbean that gave you hope for the recovery and building back better and beyond?
What I heard that gave me the most confidence that we will inevitably succeed in building back better is that firm commitment to the Sustainable Development Agenda. Despite the fact that prior to the pandemic, things had not been proceeding as well as we might have hoped, and despite the fact that the pandemic itself has caused a tremendous setback, economic, social, and in terms of public health, the commitment to leaving no one behind, to reducing poverty, to combating climate remains as firm as ever. Now, of course, the pandemic has thrown up additional challenges that the countries will have to face. Many of the heads of state referred to the lack of fiscal space, the need to deal with the debt, the problems of mobilizing sufficient resources to make the necessary investments. But the commitment to do so remains unchanged. And I think that is a very good sign for the future.
So, Ribeira, if I can ask you the same question, what captured your imagination today as you heard literally dozens of heads of state take the forum?
Thank you. I would say that the COVID pandemic, the unequal response that we had to the pandemic and associated with all this socioeconomic fallout really increased the negative impact on climate and the humanitarian and the potential crisis. The last IPCC, as they said, revealed that climate change is progressing quicker, more faster than the science could predict it. Gaps, I think the main point is the gaps between what the world really needs and what we are delivering are getting bigger. And this is a big challenge that we have. The momentum has really challenged the progress of the implementing the agenda of 2030 and the Sustainable Development Goals. So we really need a truly transformative and collective action for the next decade. Only as many of the chief of states had mentioned, like only a global response based in a really strong alliance and efficient multilateral system, a really worldwide coalition can make us to deliver this agenda and the Paris Agreement. I think the SDG roadmap is there, but now what we have is that the cooperation and the spirit of solidarity need to be really present. And this is the only way that we can move forward. And what everybody wants nowadays is the implementation. Let's move for it. I would say this is a general hope, like the sense of urgency that everybody got from it.
Absolutely. Let me follow up with you, Ms. Pinto Ribeira. You mentioned the divide, whether it's the socioeconomic divide, the digital divide, the climate divide, or even the vaccine divide. What do you want to see get more attention as you heard leaders get up and speak? What do you think is lacking in what was brought up today?
I would say the climate is the key. I would say the climate challenge is the paramount for all of that, because it can bring all together other things together with that. And I would say it's not only the government, but of course the private sector and the civil society together on that. I would say that I would address more of my concern and my energy towards the climate action. We're going to have the COP26 nearby, and hopefully we're going to get something stronger after that for the whole world.
And Mr. Harris, if I may hand you the flashlight and ask you to shine a light in areas that need more illumination, where is your call for action?
I would focus attention immediately now on the need for international cooperation. It's been something we've talked about for a very long time, but it became clear at the outbreak of the crisis that we haven't quite put our efforts where our words have led us. And this has caused a lot of difficulty for many of the developing countries to respond to the crisis, to recover from it. The lack of fiscal space that many of them are suffering from can only really be helped in the short term by support from their partners abroad. I think that's really important also, and particularly in the case of ensuring that all of us have access to the vaccines, because without that, there is very little chance that we can have a sustained economic recovery. And without the economic recovery, of course, the prospects of reaching the Sustainable Development Goals gets further and further away. Now, I do think that there is a lot that can be done within countries themselves. I think a great deal of effort has to be paid, a lot of attention paid to making sure that the resources they have are used in ways that are fully aligned with the SDGs. So we can no longer afford to have spending, for example, on subsidy policies that are not consistent with the SDGs. But we also have to try as well, I think, to plan for the future and to mobilize resources, domestic and foreign, to make the kinds of investments that we know we need to achieve the structural transformations that are necessary to deal with the climate action, the climate crisis, to deal with the biodiversity loss, to decarbonize our economies, and to put ourselves on a path of sustainable and inclusive growth so that we can finally start addressing the big problem of inequality that plagues us all.
Let me put you both on the spot. I have been speaking to youth leaders who were quite impassioned about the fact that they too are stakeholders in this conversation, and that perhaps it's not up to them to fight for a seat at the table, but for their elders to give them room and space. Let me start with you, Mr. Harris. How would you address those youth leaders?
I do think that there is a... Oh, sorry.
Go ahead. Mr. Harris, let's begin with you.
Oh, okay, thank you. I think one of the things that has to happen is that we need to realize that it is their future we're talking about, the young people, and that they have as much of a right to pronounce themselves on what they think the priorities should be and how we can achieve them. Now, of course, in many respects, it's very difficult for young people to establish a presence and to speak on equal terms with those who command the resources that are needed on the one hand, or those who maintain the monopoly over the power to make the decisions. But I think we will all benefit if we understand that the perspectives that young people bring in, because they are new and different, and because they're oriented to the future, are precisely what we need to make the changes in policy that have to happen. It's far too easy for policymakers to stick with the status quo because they know that that is something that they can manage, the consequences of that. But the status quo hasn't delivered what we need. I think that that is one area where young people are quite right to claim their space at the table. But by the same token, they have to come to that table with clearly formulated proposals and recommendations and suggestions for how we can do things differently so that we can reach the aspirations and the goals that we all share.
Indeed, and resources being a big part of that, and the acquisition. Ms. Pinto-Ribiera, let me ask you the same question about how do we give youth those priorities?
When I see the youngers say what they were saying most recently, give me a lot of hope. All the projects that we have, when we lead with people like very young, and we can pass through them the concepts that is needed, especially in developing countries like Brazil, for instance. It's where really the transformation happen. If we raise a society looking in things like that, they will be really the citizens that we need in the future. And looking forward, the green economy are open for them a lot. There will be a lot of technological momentum, innovation, and things that the youngers can help a lot. And sometimes it's very small solutions that can really surprise and make us very proud of them.
Well, Ms. Pinto-Ribiera, Mr. Harris, thank you both for your eloquent leadership and for your thoughts on this subject. And we're going to turn now to another Pathways and Partners dialogue on localizing the SDGs, which my partner, Sherwin, was able to have late last week when this beautiful studio that you see here was still en route to New York. Take a look.
to stress that cities play a very vital role in achieving the global agendas. Local engagement, participation, inclusion, and ensuring that all groups, genders, and members of society are included and adequately reflected in such a process is extremely important. Without the power of cities, there is no chance to achieve the global goals.
Let me just say that we are very proud to work with UN Habitat and our sister agencies in bringing the world's attention to the centrality of addressing COVID-19 in cities, understanding the different impacts it is having on populations within the city, and appealing to all those that this is a moment of solidarity that does begin at the local level and extends to the nation and ultimately to the world as a whole. Thank you.
Welcome, everyone, to the Pathways and Partners Dialogue on Localizing Action. Since the adoption of the Sustainable Development Goals in 2015, the UN has actively cooperated with local actors and governments and their networks to ensure that the goals are country-led and nationally owned, and that no one is left behind. COVID-19 reminds us of the crucial role local authorities play in achieving sustainable development. This is especially true in poorer areas where the pandemic has exposed deeply rooted inequalities. There is also recognition that citizens operating at subnational levels are often best positioned to devise specific solutions to the SDGs by taking local contexts into account. It is with this in mind that the UN is formally launching the Local 2030 Coalition to support the on-the-ground delivery of the SDGs. This coalition offers a convening platform to mobilize, engage, and empower local actors worldwide to accelerate progress towards the global goals. Here to discuss the promise of moving Agenda 2030 forward and implementing the Decade of Action through the empowerment of local organizations and individuals are Mr. Giorgio Marapodi, the Director General for Development Cooperation in Italy's Ministry of Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation. Italy has been